that you found somebody new. I'm thinking I'll be better without you. I wish you all the best, I hope he gives you what you need. But can nobody love like me? I can't sleep without you next to me. Running through my head, you're all I see. Nothing left to say, but you should know. Can nobody love you better? Ain't nobody gonna love like me. Love me, love me, love me, love me. Ain't nobody love you. Ain't nobody better. Love me, love me, love me, love me. Ain't nobody love you. Ain't nobody better. Love me, 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 love me. Ain't nobody love me, love me, love me, love me, love me, love me. Ain't nobody love me. Drinking out the thoughts of you and I, all the wasted time. Someday you'll see that you never could be capable of love like me. No, I can't sleep without you next to me. Running through my head, you're all I see. Nothing left to say, but you should know. Can nobody love you better? Ain't nobody gonna love like me. Love me, 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 nobody better.
I saw you standing over there. You stole my love, girl, it isn't fair. And I see you, where you move just gets me high. Ignites my flame, sets me into overdrive, sets me into overdrive.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, welcome. Anybody who's tuned in early, appreciate you guys. Anybody who's here already, you guys rule. This is awesome. I want to go ahead and add a display capture so I can, there we go. Oh my god, stop. There we go. So we can do React Boys. How's it going? Man, it feels so early. It feels so freaking early. I know it's not. It's like 8 o'clock. It's not too early. I was thinking about starting with some oversimplified videos because I've been watching these and they're very good. Holy shit, they did the Emu War from Australia. Can do that. Or I can just look at my recommended and go from that. That was 4 years ago. They've been doing that for a while. Hmm. History's cool though, but I feel like I've watched most of the oversimplified videos. That's what sucks. I hate pre-watching React content. The deal is I watch way too much YouTube. That's the problem. Watch way too much YouTube. JCS inspired. The bizarre death about okay. We can watch the French Revolution. I haven't watched the one on the French Revolution. You can do that.
This video was made possible by NordVPN. Get protected by clicking the link below and get an amazing 75% off. That's only $2.99 per month with an additional.
I remember learning about this in history class
new
in
French
like the
Revolution
8th
merch
grade.
Available now in the store, including King Louis and Marie Antoinette character pins, complete with detachable heads, just like the real thing. So I said to the Marquis de la Fufayette, "What do you think I am? Some dirty peasant? I've never worked a day in my life." Wow, that Marie Antoinette sure is pretty. Sure is. Wouldn't want to be Prince Louis though. That's going to be a lot of responsibility when he becomes king, especially since France is in financial ruin. Quite. Thank you one and all for attending the royal marriage of my grandson, the future King of France, to the Archduchess of Austria. Now for the very awkward yet historically accurate part of the ceremony, where we all watch him get into bed together.
Wait, what?
All right, now that's out of the way, let's leave the royal couple to it. You better give us an heir, you fat, ill-bred boy. Nighty-night. That's gonna be a lot of responsibility. France is in financial ruin. You fat, ill-bred boy. Quite. That's gonna be a lot of responsibility. France is in financial ruin. Fat, ill-bred boy. That's gonna be a lot of responsibility. Oh, great. He's a freaking weirdo. France, the most prosperous, cultured, and beautiful nation in the world, as it had been for centuries. An exquisite social culture, with the king and the upper classes throwing crazy parties every night, enjoying high living and fine dining. Who cares that they were only able to do so off the backs of the hard-working, starving poor? What are they gonna do? Revolt? They're only 80% of the population. No. Life in France is great. What's that, France? You want to go to war with Britain and increase your power? Go for it, little buddy. You do you. And you lost. Now you're in severe financial debt. We have no money. What do we do? Should we stop partying? Heck no. Party harder. That's okay. The peasantry will pick up the slack. They were created by God to do all the work, and you were created to reap all the benefits and party hard. That's just how society works, and we've all just accepted it for centuries. Why? Why what? Why do the nobility get to be all rich and stuff? Just because they were born into it? And the rest of us schmucks just have to accept that? Hell, why do we even need a king? Who decided?
So at the beginning of the French Revolution, I'm assuming it was a monarchical feudalism type system, right? Is that kind of what I'm gathering, or is it more I don't know.
Decided that? It all just seems very unfair and unequal, and I, for one, am starting to question it. Wow, that's very enlightened of you. And so began the Age of Enlightenment. Great philosophical thinkers across France and beyond began to question whether...
Speaking of which, I heard a theory one time that there was a theory that around the same time of the Enlightenment, people had just discovered how to roast coffee. I'm not 100% sure how accurate that is, but basically around the same time as the Enlightenment, people started to learn how to roast coffee, which is kind of hilarious because for decades everyone drank alcohol, and you had the Dark Ages or whatever. But then supposedly the idea is that when we got coffee, people that the Enlightenment happened. I don't think that's accurate. That correlation causation, right? I don't think that's the idea, but I'm pretty sure that is like the same timeline. I think if you look, coffee, the roast of coffee was discovered around the same time as the Enlightenment.
whether this beautiful nation was really all that beautiful after all. Hey, Prince Louis, bad news. Your grandpop died of smallpox this morning, which means good news, you're now the king. So just to sum up, France is in severe financial debt, and the angry populace are beginning to question how necessary you are. But hey, I believe in you, champ. You got this. Maybe. Oh no! Prince Louis Capet became King Louis XVI in May 1774. He was a notoriously weak man, and he knew it. He barely had the wisdom to rule a nation, never mind one in crisis, and he was easily manipulated by those around him. One of his first acts was to try to get revenge on the British by financing their American colony's revolution. Hey, we're an independent nation now. That was real swell of you, Louis. Couldn't have done it without you. Glad I could help. So hey, about all that money we lent you, when can we get that back? Yep, you're a great guy. I'll never forget what you've done for us. Real glad I could help, friend, but about that money, gotta go now, chum. Best of luck to you. Oh no! And now France was in even more debt. France's poor, suffering under the strain of economic ruin, watched as the nobility continued to live as though nothing was wrong. In particular, they grew increasingly disdainful of the Queen, Marie Antoinette, as she continued to spend all of France's money on her own luxurious lifestyle and fashion. While the peasants were breaking their backs in the fields, she was walking around like, hey, my hair is a boat. I'm not making that up. Her hair really was a boat. And her lavish spending earned her the nickname Madame Deficit. And speaking of the Queen, there was also a long-standing scandal around the fact that the king took a very long time to boink her, and the working classes of Paris began ridiculing the royal couple with lewd pamphlets depicting the Queen as a court thought, and the king as a wuss, unable to fulfill his marital duty. Respect for the monarchy was at an all-time low, as France's finances were spiraling out
Basically, they told him, "Hey, dude, you're
of control." And the king and his aides really only had one solution to the crisis. Tax the poor. Tax the poor. We could do a sexy calendar shoot. Tax the poor. And so it was. The poor, who were already struggling to make ends meet, found themselves being taxed from every direction. Hey, I'm the royal tax collector. Looks like you've yet to pay your income tax, head tax. By the way, how many windows you got in that house of yours? 3? Oof, yep. There's gonna be a tax for that. Hey, your local priest here. Have you paid your church tithe yet? Well, at least this one is going to the good work of God. Sure. God. I think this year God's going to buy a new swimming pool. Hey, private tax collector here. Oh, and I brought some goons with me. Just a few quick questions. How much salt did you buy this year? About 7 kilos, I think? Yep. Okay, there's gonna be a tax for that. Oh, what's that over there? And that's extra salt I held over from last year, so I wouldn't have to buy as much this year. Oh, yeah, there's a tax for that. And what are you doing with all of this salt? Well, obviously cooking. On the table. Yep. And preserving fish and meat. Oh no. Yep, and there's a tax for that. Hey, how old is he? He's 9. And so he's purchased his required amount of salt for this year, right? What? No, he's 9. Uh-oh. Sorry, little Timmy. Looks like I'm gonna have to tax you for that. Yep, salty. There's going to be a tax for that. And that's not all. A huge portion of the peasants' harvest had to be given up. And there was also the labor tax, where peasants were required to work a certain number of days for their local lord without pay. Obviously, people weren't too happy with these taxation policies, and the aggressive nature of these private tax farmers sometimes even escalated to violence. In particular though, the people really hated how inconsistent the taxation rules were across the nation, and also the fact that the first 2 estates often had to pay very little, if any tax at all. And so, the anger continued to grow. France had a population that was just about ready to explode. What could push them over the edge? How about a touch of natural disaster? A series of harsh summers and winters left the peasants' harvests in ruin, meaning they had no food or money, and the cost of bread skyrocketed. Of course, the upper classes had massive stocks of grain and wheat, so they were virtually untouched by this new crisis. But now the poor really were starving, and they began to riot. Women took to the streets, bakeries were raided, and bakers suspected of keeping bread for themselves were sometimes even hanged. Wow, this is really getting out of control. Your Majesty, we need some decisive action. You need to step up and lead us. What will you do? Okay, I've got this. I know. I'll summon the Estates General, and they'll decide what to do. You really are a fat, ill-bred boy. The Estates General was the closest thing France had to a government, apart from the king. It was a purely advisory body, and was rarely summoned. In fact, it hadn't been summoned for 175 years prior to this. But with France in a severe crisis, the king felt the time was right to call on the government to help. The Estates General was made up of representatives from the 3 estates, that is, the clergy, the nobility, and everybody else. Okay, thanks for coming everyone. The first order of business is regarding the clergy and nobility. You all get brand new Porsches. You get a Porsche, and you get a Porsche, and you get a Porsche. Everybody gets a Porsche. And now into the second order of business. France is completely out of money. Like, it's never been this bad before. Anyone got any ideas? How about we all get Lamborghinis next time? The king decided that in order to make a decision, they had to come up with a voting system. Okay, the clergy. You have a population of 130,000, so you'll get 1 vote. The nobility. You have a population of 350,000, so you'll also get 1 vote. And the third estate. You have a population of 27 million people and make up 98% of the population. Very impressive. You'll get 1 vote. The third estate were obviously pretty unhappy with this system because they kept on finding that this would happen. We propose to raise taxes on the third estate. All in favor? All opposed? 2-1. Taxes will be raised on the third estate. We propose a motion that says the first 2 estates are a bunch of poo-poo heads. All in favor? All opposed? 2-1. It's official. We are not poo-poo heads. The third estate realized that any attempt at reform would be outvoted by the 2 upper estates, and they thought that was kind of lame. So they decided that since they were 98% of the population, they could go off to form their own government, make their own laws, and take over the running of the country. And so, the National Assembly was born. The third estate was now in control, and there was nothing the king could do to stop. Haha! I've locked you all out of your building. What are you gonna do about it? We'll probably go find a different building that isn't locked. Oh, no! The National Assembly did find another unlocked building, just down the road, an indoor tennis court. Where on the 20th of June 1789, they all took the tennis court oath, pledging to continue meeting until the king finally gave in to their demands for more equality and economic reform. This new National Assembly included many of the most educated members of the Third Estate, including 2 young lawyers by the names of Maximilien Robespierre and Georges Danton. Some members of the first 2 estates even joined their cause. Some of these men formed a radical new political party called the Jacobin Club and quickly became leading figures. While many members of the Third Estate simply wanted more equality, a growing number in this Jacobin faction would begin calling for something even crazier, the removal of the king entirely. And this is where fear began to take hold. With such a volatile situation developing, everyone was afraid of something. The king feared his position was under threat, and he called in the military to take position around Paris. The Third Estate heard rumor of the gathering military force, and they feared the king was planning to round them up and arrest them. Maybe he'd even execute them. It also didn't help that the king had just dismissed France's popular finance minister, who had been trying to make reforms himself. It seemed the king was done negotiating. Fear, left unchecked, often boils over into anger, and anger detonates with violence. The angry people of Paris, after centuries of cruel inequality, harsh oppression, even starvation, fearful of having their new movement for reform demolished so soon, decided that it was now or never to take action. Screw reform. They decided they'd do one better. How about revolution? The people of Paris, believing the French military was preparing to attack, decided they should arm themselves. The National Assembly announced the creation of a bourgeois militia, the National Guard, and immediately, many troops from the French military defected over to the revolutionary side. In the early hours of July 14th, 1789, a large crowd stormed and raided the Hôtel des Invalides, a military hospital where they were able to secure a large number of rifles. The bad news was they weren't able to find any gunpowder for their new weapons. The good news was they knew exactly where to get some. A prison fortress and a symbol of royal tyranny towering over Paris, the Bastille. Mid-morning, the crowd gathered around the Bastille and demanded that the man in charge, Governor Delaunay, surrender the prison and hand over the gunpowder. Obviously, Governor Delaunay was like, no way. So he stalled for time by inviting a few members of the crowd in for negotiations. The crowd, still waiting outside, quickly became impatient, and before long, they stormed the fortress, taking on the French troops inside. Your Majesty, we've received word that the people have surrounded the Bastille. Governor Delaunay will hold them off. No need to worry. Actually, Your Majesty, it appears the crowd is now headed away from the Bastille. You see? What did I tell you? Clearly Governor Delaunay has defeated them and has them on the run. No need to worry. Your Majesty, isn't that Governor Delaunay's head on a pike? Well, Clearly, Governor Delaunay has taken on the form of a bodiless pikehead deity, and the people are so enamored with him, they're parading him around the city. No need to worry at all. When the National Assembly heard about the violence that had taken place, they had two options. Either one, they denounce it and try to carry on the revolution using peaceful means, or two, they say, damn, you stuck his head on a pike? That's pretty hardcore. And we love it. Incidentally, they went with option number two. Some historians believe this reaction paved the way for the utter violence and bloodshed that would become the legacy of the French Revolution. This widespread acceptance of violence during the Revolution is also largely credited to the writings of a certain Jean-Paul Marat, a man of science with a horrible skin condition that kept him confined to a bathtub. He began writing a radical newspaper he affectionately named The Friend of the People. Citizens of France, be very afraid. Given the chance, the king and the nobility won't hesitate to massacre us all. The solution is simple. Execute them. Kill every last one of them. Cut off 1,000 heads, and if that's not enough, cut off 1,000 more. Oh, hey Mr. Squeaky, what are you doing down there? You're so cute. Aw, I love you too, Mr. Squeaky. Mwah. Now where was I? Oh yeah. Kill them all. It became one of the most popular publications in Paris during the Revolution and succeeded in spreading ever-increasing fear and anger among the people. In August, leaders of the National Assembly, with help from a certain Thomas Jefferson, adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, an incredible document that guaranteed liberty and equal rights to all men. And when I say men, I mean men. Despite its glaring shortcomings in gender equality, the massively influential declaration would go on to inspire the struggle for liberty and equality across the planet for centuries. However, back in France, the vast majority of the people weren't really so concerned with enlightened ideas of equality as much as they were concerned with the fact that they were still starving. Bread was still expensive as hell and hard to come by. The people felt that one reason nothing had been done yet about the crisis was because the king simply couldn't see the problem. He lived in Versailles, a full 20 kilometers southwest of Paris, and as a result, lived in comfort, separated from his dirty, stinking subjects. On October 5th, a crowd of women, 7,000 strong, decided they'd do something unprecedented. They decided they'd remove that separation and confront the king directly. The women marched all the way to the king's palace in Versailles. Along the way, the crowd continued to grow into the tens of thousands, and when they arrived, they demanded an audience with the king. What are those things outside the palace? They're poor people, Your Majesty. That's poor people? They say they're hungry. Hungry? Then let them eat cake. Wow. See, this is the exact BS that led to this whole mess in the first place. You're so out of touch. They're writhing around in the filth, breaking their back to barely scrape by, and they come to you demanding just the basic ability to feed themselves, and you think a slice of cake will sort them out? Well, then let them eat Taco Bell Crunchwrap Supreme. Wow. They're not that desperate. Members of the crowd actually managed to break into the palace with the intention of killing the queen, who narrowly escaped through a secret passage in her bedroom. The enraged mob killed several members of the royal guard and raised their heads on pikes, which, if you haven't noticed yet, is something they were quite fond of doing. The king had no choice but to come out and talk to the crowd. He agreed to accept his new position, sharing power with the revolutionary government, and to return to Paris with the crowd, removing the separation between king and subject. King Louis had a problem with people constantly raiding his palace, but one thing he didn't have a problem with was people raiding his computer, because he used NordVPN. If, like me, video with a 30-month.
So there's a part 2. Okay. It's
King
pretty
Louis
good.
and his family were now in the Tuileries Palace in Paris, where for the next couple of years, he watched as the revolutionary government began to strip away his power. And fearing for his safety, he had to stay on their good side. Hey, look who it is. It's my favorite revolutionaries. Yep, I'm your #1 fan. What can I do for you? Hey, King Louis, so we've made a few decisions. First, all of your friends in the nobility are going to have to pay taxes the same as everyone else. Great idea. I love it. And as a side note, the tax money can no longer pay for all your lavish parties. Great. I hate those parties. They're so awkward. And also, we're taking away your Porsche. Oh, come on! I mean, yay. The king continually found demand after demand being made of him to prove his support for the revolution. On one occasion, a mob would invade the palace and demand he wear the revolutionary bonnet. This is the face of a man who is definitely pretending he wants to wear that bonnet. Now around here, I want to mention that one thing King Louis had a problem with was people constantly raiding his palace. But one thing he didn't have a problem with was raiding noobs on this video's sponsor, Raid Shadow
Damn
Legends.
it.
Raid Shadow... He was married to an... Go to... Now where was I? Oh yeah. Seeing the situation rapidly turning against him, the king decided it might be a good idea to leave France and mount a campaign to retake his country from abroad. Luckily for him, he was married to an Austrian. So on the night of June 20th, 1791, the king and his family disguised themselves as servants and attempted to flee to the Austrian Netherlands. The royal carriage made a stop in the town of Varennes, and the postmaster there was like, "Hey guys, what's up? Where are you off to? We are but a collection of inconspicuous servants heading for the border for no particular reason at all." Say, you, the fat one, you look kind of familiar. Aren't you the king? Nope. Let me see your passport. It says here you're King Louis the 16th. Nope, not me. Take him away, boys. The king was promptly returned to Paris, but now the jig was up. His lack of support for the revolution was clear to all, and many considered him a straight-up traitor who tried to abandon his people. As a result, the new constitution of 1791 completely reduced his powers to that of a simple figurehead, a constitutional monarch. However, radicals, such as those in the Jacobin Club, were outraged that the king wasn't to be removed entirely. So a month later, these radicals staged a protest on the Champ de Mars, calling for the king's removal. The government of Paris feared an insurrection was mounting, and they sent the military to disperse the crowd. The confrontation escalated and resulted in the Revolutionary National Guard firing on a crowd of revolutionaries. It was a massacre. The incident exposed a deep division within the Brotherhood of the Revolution. On one side, the moderates who wanted to keep the king as a figurehead. On the other, radicals who wanted to see the king deposed and heads roll. In the wake of the massacre, these radicals received a wave of support. And speaking of rolling heads, one form of equality the revolution introduced was equality in execution. This meant no more torturous drawing and quartering, no more inhumane hanging. They wanted all criminals, regardless of economic status, to receive the same penalty, a quick and painless one. Luckily, a man by the name of Dr. Joseph Guillotine had an idea. A heavy blade that falls like thunder. The head flies off, blood spurts, and the man is no more. The guillotine, otherwise known as the National Razor. The guillotine made its debut in 1791 as the new form of execution. The writings of Marat and others continued to call for the execution of anyone suspected of working against the revolution. For him, this included some members of the clergy and nobility who had previously benefited from the cruel system of inequality that existed before the revolution. In many parts of the countryside, local lords had found themselves become a target. "Sire, the peasants, they're revolting." Oh, come on, that's a bit harsh. Sure, they smell a bit, but I wouldn't say they're revolting. Oh yes, I see what you mean. Increasingly, these French aristocrats began fleeing France to find solitude in other parts of Europe. And once again, fear began to take hold. The privileged classes of these foreign nations didn't like what they were seeing because they feared revolutionary ideas may spread to their own lands. The National Assembly, actually now the Legislative Assembly, feared that these nations may decide to attack. Then why don't we attack them first? No, you idiots, we are definitely not ready for war yet. Did somebody say something? France declared war on Austria in April 1792 and immediately got pummeled. It also didn't help that Austria's ally, Prussia, joined in the fighting. The Prussian Duke of Brunswick posted a letter warning the revolutionaries that if anything happened to the king, he would burn Paris to the ground. The Duke's letter proved to be a massive success in inspiring the people of Paris to do the exact opposite of what he intended. They were enraged by the threat, and on the 10th of August 1792, the tension in the city exploded, and a mob stormed the king's palace. Fighting broke out between the revolutionaries and the king's Swiss guard, with casualties in the hundreds. King Louis fled and took refuge in the chamber of the Legislative Assembly, where Robespierre and his radical Jacobins were gaining ever more power. Given the developing situation, the chamber decided to hold a vote, and in what some considered to be a second revolution, it was decided to suspend the monarchy entirely. King Louis XVI was now just plain old Louis, and he was sent to a prison cell where an eye could be kept on him. A month later, the newly established National Convention officially declared the French Republic, and society underwent a massive change. Enlightened ideas of democracy and equality were being implemented, but very quickly, these ideas seemed to become secondary to fear, paranoia, and a thirst for blood. The new republic began working to violently remove any semblance of the old royalist regime. The church became a prime target. Priests who refused to take an oath to the revolution were deported or arrested. A new state-sponsored atheistic religion named the Cult of Reason was created as a replacement for the Catholic Church. Notre Dame, along with many other churches, had their religious treasures destroyed and were converted to temples of reason. Even the Christian calendar didn't survive, as a brand new revolutionary calendar was soon introduced. Hey honey, I'm home. Yeah, whatever, jerk. Whoa, what's wrong with you? You forgot. Forgot what? Everything! This entire year! My birthday was on the 3rd of Germinal, our anniversary was the 12th of Thermidor, and you promised that in Frimaire, we'd go on a romantic weekend trip to Venice. No, I said we'd do that in December. December hasn't been a thing for years! The government of Paris, now under the control of the radical sans-culottes, began rounding up suspected enemies of the revolution and sending them to prison in the thousands. Naturally, a large number of those arrested were members of the clergy and aristocracy. As France's foreign enemies continued to close in, panic spread. Georges Danton made impassioned calls for men to defend the Republic, and tens of thousands of troops left Paris for the front lines. However, in their absence, Paris was left to its own devices. As enemy troops arrived in Verdun, the people of Paris feared that their crowded prisons were becoming a breeding ground for counter-revolutionary conspiracy. What would happen if the Prussians reached Paris and freed the aristocrats? Marat believed he knew what would happen. The aristocrats would enact their vengeance on the people. Fearing those they had already imprisoned, mobs descended on Paris's prisons. They broke in, and during the brutal September massacres, aristocrats, priests, and others were tried and executed on the spot. Even women and children weren't spared. With over 1,600 victims, word of the massacre spread across Europe. One British newspaper wondered, are these the rights of man? Is this the liberty of human nature? But there was still one man in particular that Robespierre and his radicals really wanted to see executed. Austria and Prussia pledged that after they defeated France, they'd return King Louis to the throne. Well, checkmate Austria and Prussia, because you can't return a man to the throne if he's already dead. Citizen Louis Capet was put on trial for treason. Obviously, he was found guilty, but his punishment was less certain. Many moderates wanted to simply deport him, but Robespierre insisted the revolution could only live if the king was dead. A vote was held, and by just one vote, Louis was sentenced to the guillotine. If you don't mind, I'd like to say a few words first. Gentlemen, I am innocent of everything of which I am accused. Wait, you're too loud. They can't hear me. Hang on, I haven't finished yet. Wait, dude! Uncool. In her prison cell, Marie Antoinette heard the guns fire, signaling her husband's death. Before long, she would meet the same fate. Back on the war front, France defied all expectations and actually managed to push the enemy back. But then more countries joined the coalition against France, and it all went to pot again. What do? Conscript the masses! The National Convention introduced a conscription law, with each regional department having to meet a certain quota of men for the army. However, not everyone was happy with this new law. You see, while Paris was definitely a hotbed for radical revolutionary fervor, some of the regions outside of Paris weren't quite so keen on the revolution. Some were largely still conservative, still supported the church, and just didn't suffer from that much inequality before the revolution. So as the revolution turned increasingly violent and anti-Christian, many were outraged. Now, they were being conscripted to fight for the new republic they hated. That was the last straw. Counter-revolutionary uprisings erupted in a number of regions across France. Some would last for years, such as in the northwest, where a large-scale uprising was led by the Owls. Why were they called the Owls? Because their leader was named Jean Owl. Why was he called Jean Owl? Possibly because he could do a really good impression of an owl. Really? That's what we're going with? Owls? Just because this guy can do an impression of one? Hit him with it, Jean. Hoot, hoot. Yeah, okay, that's pretty good. The Chouannerie uprising lasted all the way until 1800. In the summer of 1793, the southern city of Toulon invited the British Navy over for some tea and crumpets. And then they asked if they'd possibly like to stay and occupy the city. Being an important naval base, this was a heavy blow to the Republic, who sent a relatively unknown young captain by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte to help stage the siege of the city. Toulon was recaptured by France in the winter, and for his service, Napoleon was promoted to the rank of Brigadier General. The most infamous counter-revolution, however, occurred in the Vendée region. Throughout 1793, revolutionary forces clashed with the region's Catholic and Royal Army. The Republic defeated the counter-revolution through cruel pacification. In particular, General Jean-Baptiste Carrier committed brutal atrocities. In one instance, he had thousands of civilians, priests, women, and children tied to ships, which were then sunk. Carrier would later be found guilty of war crimes and executed. Back in Paris, the government was still dominated by moderates. With the war going badly, revolts in the provinces, and the economy getting worse, it seemed the government just wasn't doing a very good job. Radicals' fear for the safety of the revolution intensified, and Marat even began calling for the moderates in the government to be executed. In return, the moderates called for the arrest of Marat. This led to a chain of events with the two sides in heated conflict. Robespierre declared the Jacobins to be an insurrection and called on the people to arm themselves. It all ended on the 31st of May 1793, with the National Convention surrounded by radical sans-culottes and 29 moderate Girondin politicians arrested. From this moment on, the moderates ceased to be a political force. Robespierre and his radicals would be in almost total control of the government. And this brings us to the story of a woman named Charlotte Corday. Charlotte lived in the northwest city of Caen, and like many in the area, was horrified at the rapid radicalization and increasing violence of the revolution. And the man she blamed more than anyone was Jean-Paul Marat. She wanted to bring peace back to France, and so she did something drastic. She traveled to Paris and told Marat she had a list of enemies for him to publish in his paper. Marat eagerly invited her in for a meeting. So where's that list of enemies you promised me? Here it is. Wait a minute, this isn't a list of enemies. It just says, yippee-ki-yay, mother... And just like that, Marat was no more. Charlotte was quickly arrested and sent to the guillotine. Her dream of restoring peace, however, died with her. Marat became a martyr. In temples of reason, symbols of the dead Marat became the new crucifix. In death, he became an even more powerful inspiration for the extreme levels of violence that were about to rip throughout the new republic. That's right, here comes the Reign of Terror. If you thought this revolution already sounds pretty violent, well, you ain't seen nothing yet, son. The radicals were now in control, and they believed not only was France surrounded by foreign enemies, but that within the masses, there were also plenty of internal ones too. Individuals not loyal to the revolution, conspiring to bring about its downfall. Robespierre and the rest of the radical faction were having none of it. A new committee of public safety was established with 12 members. Its purpose was to protect the new French Republic from its enemies, and it basically became a 12-man dictatorship with Robespierre as its leading voice. The Revolutionary Tribunal was also reinstated, a special court created to streamline the process of trying suspected enemies and handing out their death sentences. With these two new institutions, Robespierre wanted to scare France's enemies straight. In September 1793, it was announced that terror would be the order of the day. In other words, fear had become official government policy. And from then onwards, we enter into the period known as the Reign of Terror. Spies and secret police were everywhere and watched the people closely. France's public had to be extremely careful what they said and how they behaved. Obviously, criticizing this new system, or the government, would quickly have you sent off to the guillotine. But that's not all. Even the most minor offense could have you tried before the Revolutionary Tribunal. Hello, Citizen Martin. Hello, Monsieur Dubois. Monsieur? Did I just hear you say Monsieur? That's the old style of address, my friend. To the guillotine! You know what? I didn't like him, but I do feel kinda bad for the king and his family. Oof, expressing sympathy for the royal family, are we? To the guillotine! 12 sous for a loaf of bread? That's way overpriced. To the guillotine! Man, this bread line is taking forever. To the guillotine! And you look like you're thinking anti-revolutionary thoughts. To the guillotine. Max, we're sending way too many people to the guillotine. To the guillotine! Chop, 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 chop. It was insane. All across France, about 40,000 people were killed for suspected crimes against liberty. Let's say your neighbor won't stop mowing the lawn at 7 in the morning. Well, then all you gotta do is tell the government they've been talking smack about the revolution. And there's a good chance they'll end up in front of the Revolutionary Tribunal. Maybe they'll even be executed, taking a metaphorical load off your shoulders and a literal one off theirs. The most prominent victim of the Reign of Terror was a certain Marie Antoinette, who was finally tried and found guilty of treason in 1793. She expected she'd be brought to the guillotine in a royal carriage, fit for a queen. All the Republic...
Oh my god, I just realized that that's a fucking thing from Star Wars on her head. That's so funny.
Could provide for her, however, was a wooden tumbril. At 37 years old, the most hated woman in French history met her end on the 16th of October, 1793. Robespierre had saved the revolution through terror. Internal dissent was being suppressed. The food situation was no longer quite as bad. Even the French military had got its act together again and pummeled the Allies at the Battle of Fleurus. For Danton and his followers, the time was right to try to normalize the French Republic. Hey Robespierre, so we were thinking that since things are finally going better, maybe we should rein in the terror. And while we're on it, we could possibly start taking it easier on the church, and also try to end this costly war. Oh, crap. As time went on, Robespierre seemed to go, for lack of a better term, a bit mental. He was hell-bent on creating what he called a republic of virtue, and for him, this meant amping up the bloodshed even more. Throughout the spring and summer of 1794, executions reached an unprecedented level during a period known as the Great Terror. Even those closest to him found their way to the guillotine if they dared oppose his ideas and actions, and he began alienating himself from the rest of the convention. He created a new deistic religion called the Cult of the Supreme Being, along with the new annual Festival of the Supreme Being. Man, I think Robespierre is really starting to lose it. He thinks he's a god or something. Nonsense. Sure, he's gone a little extreme, but he doesn't think he's a god. My children, bathe your immortal souls in the virtue of my republic. Okay, yeah, he's completely lost it. Robespierre's ultimate mistake, however, came on July 26th, when he made a speech to the National Convention, in which he said this: I have in my hand a brand new list of enemies to be sent to the guillotine, and many of you are on this list, but I'm not going to tell you who yet. What do you think of that? I think we should send Robespierre to the guillotine first. All in favor? Oh, no. 2 days later, Robespierre became the final victim of the monstrous terror and paranoia he had created. Many historical accounts of the revolution end here with the death of Robespierre and his terror, but the revolution officially continued for another 5 years until 1799. So what happened between now and then? Well, after the fall of Robespierre, a more moderate political group called the Thermidorians took control of the convention. They wanted to restore stability to the government. Now, Robespierre's allies and other radicals who had fueled the terror themselves became the target of political suppression. Bourgeois street fighters took on the radical sans-culottes in the streets during a period named the White Terror. In 1795, the Thermidorians drafted a new constitution and created a government called the Directory, with the purpose of preventing power from being able to fall into the hands of a single individual again. As this new government was being established, royalists who wanted to bring the monarchy back to France saw this moment as an opportunity to strike. They staged an insurrection in Paris and battled with the National Guard in the streets. Luckily, one Napoleon Bonaparte happened to be in Paris at the time, and he took control of the situation, firing on the crowd and putting down the insurrection. From this moment on, the people of Paris would never again be able to stage a popular uprising and lost their control over the revolution. For his actions, Napoleon became a general and was sent to take control of the French armies in Italy. The new Directory remained a fairly ineffective government for the remainder of the revolution. It was plagued with corruption and struggled to keep the economy afloat, and as a result, wasn't very popular. For the people of France, with the strict social customs of both royalist France and the terror gone, they didn't really know what to do with themselves. Men no longer removed their hats when talking to women. Different classes began intermingling, and a publication began circulating that looked a lot like a modern dating app. It was social anarchy. Outside of France, the war continued. In 1795, France took the Netherlands, where they set up a puppet state. Then they negotiated both Prussia and Spain out of the war. The British attempted to land French royalists in the west to reinforce rebellion, but that plan failed. In 1796, the French planned a three-pronged attack with the aim of marching on Vienna and knocking Austria out of the war. The two northern armies were defeated and forced to retreat. However, Napoleon in the south, with groundbreaking military strategy, won battle after battle after battle. He pushed the Austrians out of Italy and began closing in on Vienna. The Austrians freaked out, and Napoleon oversaw the signing of a peace treaty. He had almost single-handedly knocked Austria out of the war, and by the way, he was only 28, so maybe it's about time you moved out of your mom's basement. Napoleon became a famed hero among the French people, but his aspirations were still higher. He briefly went off to...
Imagine by fucking age 20. Oh my god. That's fucking wild. That's wild, dude.
Egypt and discovered a bunch of gnarly Egyptian stuff, but then the British destroyed his fleet and trapped his forces. Say, Napoleon, sir, you're not going to leave us here stuck in Egypt and return to France, are you? Nonsense, my boy. I would never dream of abandoning my loyal soldiers. Wow, what's that over there? On his return to Paris, Napoleon found himself to be extremely popular, and the government extremely unpopular, and he started getting some power-hungry ideas. Conveniently, a politician named Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès approached Napoleon and said, "Hey man, since you're so popular, do you want to help me stage a coup?" Great idea. Let's stage a coup, and then I'll coup you. What? Napoleon, with the help of his politician brother, entered the government chamber, possibly got punched in the face, and finally his troops intimidated the council to dissolve the government and create a new constitution that basically made Napoleon a dictator. So there you have it, the French Revolution, born with the great promise of liberty and equality. The common people dared challenge an oppressive system that had existed for centuries. But before they knew it, they found liberty sidelined by terror, equality that possibly didn't quite hit the mark, and an absolute monarchy replaced by an absolute dictator. Napoleon began stabilizing French society. He restored the Catholic Church and got rid of that crazy calendar, among other things. But he remained ever ambitious. He was France's first consul, but he slept soundly at night dreaming of being something even bigger. Napoleon's expansionist aspirations, combined with the ongoing conflict in Europe, would eventually lead the continent into a huge conflict known today as
That's pretty good. That was pretty good. I'm still trying to wake up. I'm gonna start the next video, but I'm gonna leave my headphones on. I'm gonna go fix some coffee. I kind of want to watch the Emu War, but let's do World War II. I don't think I've watched the World War II one.
This video was made possible by Skillshare.
I'll be back.
Churchill was a man with many talents. He was an artist, a butterfly enthusiast, and he had an unpublished manuscript about aliens. Clearly, he was a man with an insatiable thirst for knowledge. Maybe he could have loaded up his computer and logged onto Skillshare, an online learning community with more than 19,000 classes in design, business, technology, and more. Perhaps he was considering a side career in fashion, but didn't know where to start. On Skillshare, he would find courses in fashion design and garment construction. Or if he wanted to learn app design, improve his photography, or just how to make a really good quesadilla, he would have found courses for all of these and more on Skillshare. Skillshare gives you access to high-quality classes taught by genuine experts working in their field. I work heavily with animation, and I was genuinely blown away by the number of really useful courses available to me, like this class full of tips and tricks for creating vector art, or this one for creating character walk cycles. For an annual subscription, Skillshare is under $10 a month. And if you'd like to try it out first, then I've got a deal just for oversimplified viewers. The first 1,000 people to use this link, which can be found in the description, will get their first 2 months of Skillshare for just 99 cents. Be sure to try it out using the link in the description and learn something new today. Now, without further ado. It's 1902. A young man by the name of Benito Mussolini moves from Italy to Switzerland to avoid military service. He gets big into socialism, working for trade unions, writing for socialist newspapers, advocating a violent overthrow of European monarchies, the whole shebang. This gets him in a bit of trouble with the Swiss police, so he gets arrested, sent back to Italy, set free, returns to Switzerland, is arrested again, goes back to Italy again, completes his military service after previously avoiding it, and then after a brief stint as an elementary school teacher, he finally returns to work as an avid socialist. His speeches and journalistic abilities made him famous among Italian socialists. He was anti-war, so when Italy colonized Libya in 1910, he rioted and got arrested. Then World War I came along, and once again he protested Italy's involvement. But then he thought, wait a minute, this war could bring about the social climate needed to overthrow European monarchies and bring about the socialist revolution everywhere. And suddenly he was pro-war. But his fellow socialists didn't like his new pro-war stance, so they kicked him out of the party. So then he said, you know what? I'm done with socialism. We need something new, not based on class divisions tearing us apart, but based on unity through nationality. We'll conquer the Mediterranean and reunite all Italian peoples just like the days of the Roman Empire. I'll call it fascismo, and it will guide the Italian nation to greatness. That's all well and good, Mr. Mussolini, but what kind of haircut am I giving you? Let's go with bold. Italy had been on the winner's side in World War I, and they hoped they were going to get a lot out of it, but in the end, they only got a little, and they felt cheated. On top of that, a bad economy and weak governments meant that the Italian people were a little unhappy. So when Mussolini came along and said that he could fix everything, his fascist movement gained a lot of support. In 1922, he went to the king and said, "Make me prime minister, or I'll make me prime minister." And the king said, "You and what army?" "This army." Fair enough. Then he went about establishing a dictatorship with himself at its center. Europe had its first fascist dictator. Next up, Germany. Germany had been on the loser's side, and they got absolutely wrecked by the Treaty of Versailles. They lost territory, had to demilitarize the Rhineland, had to reduce their army to just 100,000 men, couldn't have an air force, had to pay the Allies a huge amount of money that it didn't have, and a new rule was established that every Englishman withheld the right to walk into the center of Berlin, pick out any German they wanted, and spank the hell out of them. I made that last one up, but it helps you understand how all of this felt to Germans. On top of that, a bad economy and weak governments meant that when a small angry man with a silly mustache came along and said that he could fix everything, the German people loved it. Hitler had been a soldier during World War I, and he was crazy patriotic, and nobody was madder than him about Germany's humiliation. He helped start a new political party, and in 1923 attempted a march on Munich with his boys. And then he got arrested. But his popularity grew, and in 1933, the president made him chancellor. He believed he was Germany's great destined savior, and he went full megalomaniac, establishing a dictatorship with himself at its center. Europe had fascist dictator number 2. Hitler and Mussolini had a lot of the same ideas, but more importantly, they had the same enemies, and they started to get along. Anyone else want to be friends? Franco? No? You good? I do. Who's that? It's Japan, and they've taken over northern China. Let's rewind a bit. Japan had isolated itself from the rest of the world for over 200 years until the Americans showed up and said, "You're going to trade with us and you're going to like it." Then the Western powers imposed a bunch of unequal treaties, meaning Japan's economy was bust. They also had no natural resources, so they decided to go get some. They went to war with China to gain a sphere of influence over Korea, and they took a bunch of China's stuff. But then the West said, "Hey, cut that out." And since Japan couldn't take on the West, they said, "Okay, I guess we'll just go home." Wait a minute, what are you doing? Taking advantage of a weakened China and setting up spheres of influence. But I was the one who weakened them. We know. And you guys didn't let me have anything. We know. That seems unfair. We don't think so. Okay, see ya. So Japan thought, screw this, and went to war with Russia, and stunned everyone by actually winning. Then they fully annexed Korea, but they didn't stop there. In World War I, they took Germany's colonies and islands in Asia. And then in an incident that was maybe staged by the Japanese army, a bomb blew up a Japanese train in Manchuria, giving them an excuse to launch an invasion and take over. So here's the situation. Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Japan all believe they're racially superior, all feel hostility towards the Allies, and all want to militarize and take over more stuff. And so they did. Let's start with Germany. Hitler hated the Treaty of Versailles, and now he was ready to begin undoing it. In complete violation of the treaty, the first Luftwaffe squadrons were set up, conscription was introduced, and he pimped up his army. The Allies did nothing. Then Hitler sent his army back into the demilitarized Rhineland, giving orders to immediately retreat if the Allies showed up. The Allies did nothing. With his military re-strengthened, he could now move on to step 2. He wanted to rapidly increase the Aryan population, and to do so, he needed Lebensraum, or in other words, he would have to take over the world. But for now, a good portion of Europe would do, and he began eyeing up his neighbors. The Allies finally started to get worried, so they implemented a fairly useless diplomatic strategy called appeasement, and it went a little something like this. Hitler would say, "I want that thing," and the Allies would say, "You can't have that thing." "Okay, you can have that thing, but no more." "I want that thing." And repeat. In 1938, Hitler's army marched into Austria and just took it, with no resistance. Boom, this is Germany now. Next, he demanded to be given the Sudetenland, an area of Czechoslovakia with many ethnic Germans. The Allies held a meeting with Hitler in Munich and said, "Look, we're going to give you what— Hang on, this meeting is about my territory. Shouldn't I come to the meeting too? Anyway, we're going to give you what you want." "Really?" "Yeah." "Just like that?" "Yep." "What's the catch?" "Just sign this piece of paper promising you won't invade the rest of Czechoslovakia." Okay. Then Chamberlain returned home victorious, waving his signed piece of paper in the air, declaring crisis to be averted and the continuation of world peace, and we built a statue of Chamberlain in his honor, and every day on the 30th of September we celebrate Chamberlain Day. Hitler's invading the rest of Czechoslovakia. What? He's invading the rest of Czechoslovakia. Oh. You lied to me. What do you expect? I'm Hitler. Not to be outdone, Mussolini also wanted to get in on the action. He thought to himself, isn't there a not yet colonized nation somewhere which is so underdeveloped that the people would be defending themselves against our tanks with literal bows and arrows and wooden spears? Oh, there is? Fantastic. And so he took it. Italy also wanted to control the entrance to the Adriatic Sea, so they occupied Albania. Then, in another incident which was maybe staged by the Japanese, gunfire was exchanged by Japanese and Chinese troops at the Marco Polo Bridge, and the Japanese launched yet another invasion against China. They swept through Beijing and Shanghai, and then advanced through the Yangtze Valley to China's then capital, Nanking. It was here that saw the worst of Japan's shocking atrocities committed against the Chinese people. Back in Europe, Germany and Italy made their relationship status official by signing the Pact of Steel. Then, Hitler turned his eyes towards Poland and the hated Polish corridor splitting Germany in two. At this point, the Allies really had to put their foot down, and they warned him that an invasion of Poland would mean war. Hitler had planned to continue his advance eastward, but he didn't want to end up fighting a war on two fronts. So for now he made an alliance with Stalin, saying, "How about we both invade Poland and split it between the two of us, and I definitely won't not refrain from not betraying you sometime in the future." Sounds good. This new alliance stunned the West. On the 1st of September 1939, German troops entered Poland, and Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Poles fought hard, but they were no match for the two giants crashing down on them from either side. Then came a period known as the Phony War, where everyone just sort of sat around not doing much. The French had launched a small invasion into the Saarland, but they maintained mostly defensive positions, and after a while decided to just turn around and call it a day. Speaking of France, the French were still super proud of their victory in World War I, and they hadn't really moved on from it. They still used horses, they dispatched messages by motorbike instead of using radio, orders from the commander-in-chief were usually pretty vague, and the troops were rarely inspected. They built a line of defenses along their German border, but didn't bother extending it all the way to the Channel, and they wouldn't launch artillery strikes against Germany out of fear of being retaliated against. In a war, they didn't want to attack the enemy. And at first the UK wasn't much better. Chamberlain still naively hoped that the war could be ended diplomatically. Instead of bombing raids, the RAF dropped propaganda leaflets over German cities, which one air marshal said likely did nothing but provide the continent with toilet paper for the duration of the war. They also only sent 200,000 men to France, while the French had mobilized millions. Both Britain and France wanted to avoid a repeat of the First World War, and so they wanted to keep the war as far from home as possible. So they turned their eyes north, towards Norway. Neutral Sweden was exporting iron ore to Germany through neutral Norway, so the Allies asked them if they could please stop exporting iron ore to Germany, but this request was refused. Then, the Soviet Union attacked Finland, so the Allies said, "How about we land troops in Norway and move them across Sweden to go help out your good pal Finland, and along the way maybe take control of all your iron fields." But Norway and Sweden still said no. So the UK mined the waters around Norway to force any transport ships into international waters, and they also attacked a German tanker they found in the area. Hitler realized what the Allies were up to, and he quickly moved to secure his supply of iron ore. He launched an invasion through Denmark into Norway. The Allies rushed to land troops at key ports along the coast, but Germany had taken control of Norway's airfield, and their air superiority decided the fight. The Allies had to retreat. After this slightly embarrassing failure, Chamberlain resigned and was replaced with Winston Churchill, who had a slightly different approach to dealing with the Germans. Hitler's overall strategy was similar to Germany's First World War strategy. Attack France, defeat France, knocking out the UK in the process, then turn on the Soviet Union and win the war. During the Phony War, the Allies had given Hitler time to prepare his forces. Now, he was ready to attack. The Allies had wanted to place troops in Belgium, but Belgium had refused, and in a move that surprised pretty much no one, Hitler launched an invasion to get around France's defenses. The Allies charged into Belgium at full speed to meet the German invasion head-on, and it looked like a repeat of the First World War was coming. But this time, Hitler had a trick up his sleeve. Blitzkrieg. As the Germans advanced, they sent thousands of refugees westward, slowing down the Allies. Then, to the south, the French had left the Ardennes, an area full of hills and forests, pretty underdefended because they thought it was naturally impenetrable. Well, the Germans were about to penetrate it with everything they had. They smashed 50 Wehrmacht divisions through and encircled the Allied armies at lightning speed. The best of the Allied forces were now trapped. The Germans squeezed in from all sides, taking out France's best armies and nearly wiping out the British too, but they managed to make a desperate last-minute escape at Dunkirk, with British civilian ships even making the perilous journey to bring their young men home. With most of the French forces depleted, the Germans breezed through, taking Paris, and France fell. What the Germans couldn't do in World War I, Hitler had done just like that. Hitler hoped that with the fall of France, the UK would also lose hope and sue for peace. But quite annoyingly, it didn't, and he needed to secure the Western Front, so he tried to force them into submission with mind games. The UK were now all alone, and Hitler wanted to emphasize that. First of all, just before France fell, Italy finally declared war on the Allies, making the UK's situation even worse. Next, instead of just occupying all of France, Hitler occupied the coastal areas for defense, but allowed France to continue its existence as a German puppet state. This way, it looked like the UK's old ally had decided to switch sides. Hitler also hoped that the UK wouldn't attack any of her old allies' navy bases or colonies in Africa, giving Hitler an extra line of defense to the south. But the UK made sure to respond to this by sailing down to France's navy base in Algeria and wrecking a bunch of ships. So have at it. Hitler then began laying down plans for an invasion of Great Britain. Before German troops could land on British soil, he would first need air and naval superiority across the Channel. Waves of German bombers came, while the completely outnumbered RAF worked bravely around the clock in an attempt to quell the German attacks. At first, the Luftwaffe targeted British ports and coastal facilities. Then it attacked RAF bases, crippling the RAF's ability to defend the nation. And it looked like Hitler's Great British invasion was coming. But then, Churchill ordered a small, pretty insignificant bombing raid over Berlin. It didn't do much damage, but Hitler was furious, and he immediately ordered the Luftwaffe to refocus its attacks on civilian targets in London. Children were sent off to the countryside away from their parents to avoid danger, and frequent trips to air raid shelters became a daily occurrence. But British morale held firm. Smiling, knitting, lounging casually, these people have balls of steel. This refocusing on London also gave the RAF breathing space to reorganize, so Hitler kind of shot himself in the foot there. Just the foot for now. Finally, the Luftwaffe sent one massive all-out attack on London, and the RAF successfully repelled it, destroying many of the German aircraft and placing air superiority firmly in British hands. Hitler's invasion had to be postponed, but the bombing of British cities continued for some time. This video was made possible by Skillshare, an online learning community. Stick around until the end of the video to learn how you can get an exclusive deal just for oversimplified viewers. So what else is happening? Well, when I said Britain was all alone, that wasn't entirely true. Many Commonwealth nations and other Allied colonies had joined the war in Britain's support. They would play a key role throughout the war, particularly in the African and Italian campaigns. On the Axis side, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Defensive Tripartite Pact, bringing their military alliance even closer together. The Soviet Union's war against Finland should have been an easy victory, but it became a humiliating struggle, and their military ineptitude was put on full display. In the end, they did force the Finns to sue for peace. Then, they continued their honorable campaign of pushing around much smaller countries by annexing the Baltic states and part of northern Romania. France's colonies in equatorial Africa were like, heck no, we aren't going to join the Germans, and they all pledged their allegiance to free France, except for Gabon, which had to be taken by military force. The Allies also tried to capture the strategic port of Dakar, but that ended in failure. Mussolini had seen Hitler's successes, and he thought now it was Italy's time to shine. So he tried to take British Somaliland, and that went pretty well. Then he tried to take Egypt, and that went less well. Then he tried to take Greece, and that went really badly. Churchill began referring to Italy as Europe's soft underbelly. He began favoring a military campaign from the south and started sending British troops to Greece. All of this had Hitler pretty concerned, and he moved to protect his southern flank. He had been getting friendly with Hungary and twisted their arm into signing the Tripartite Pact and joining the Axis powers. Romania was also eager to join for protection against the Soviet Union. The Tripartite Pact was designed to prevent any other countries from deciding to join the Allies, specifically Britain's old ally, the pesky United States of America. When war first broke out, American public opinion was strongly against joining in. In 1940, there was an election. The Republican candidate said, "I will not send any young Americans to die in Europe," and sitting President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "I will also not send any young Americans to die in Europe. Unless I have to, then I might." And Roosevelt won. Churchill asked him to join the war, but Roosevelt said, "No can do, Winston, but you know what? Here, have some weapons." America began supplying the Allies with food and munitions, but there was one problem. German U-boats were sinking thousands of Allied supply ships in the Atlantic, including American ones. If the Germans could sever Britain's supply line, the UK would starve. Throughout the war, the Allies had to come up with better technology to fight the U-boats. Improved radar, aircraft with longer range, better weaponry and convoy tactics. At one point, a man even called a meeting and said, "Pykrete. You take some wood, you take some ice, you put them together, you get pykrete." And then he pulled out a gun and shot some wood and it shattered. And then he shot some pykrete and the bullet ricocheted off it and hit someone else in the conference room. Then they tried to make a pykrete aircraft carrier, but that idea was scrapped because that's a really dumb idea. In the end, Alan Turing and his team of codebreakers cracked Germany's Enigma code, and the U-boats gradually became less and less of a threat. Back in Africa, Britain decided to push Italy out of Egypt. Hey, that was pretty easy, so they kept going. Hitler realized he was going to have to finally step in and do something. He went to Bulgaria and Yugoslavia and said, "Hey, I'm going to move troops through you to get to Greece, so either join us or, be invaded." Bulgaria opted to join them. Yugoslavia opted to be invaded. Then Greece finally fell to the joint German-Italian invasion. The British had moved troops from North Africa to fight in Greece, which helped Rommel and his tank divisions push the British back to Egypt, and they could have kept going, but a small, mostly Australian force held out under siege for 8 months in Tobruk, denying the Germans a strategic port city and disrupting their supply line. Despite having some success in the Middle East, the British didn't seem like any real threat for now. Hey, Soviet Union, look out! With 3 million troops, Hitler launched the largest ground invasion in history, and Stalin was far from ready. Both Churchill and Roosevelt had warned him of an impending attack, but he dug his head in the sand and the Soviets didn't stand a chance. Germany made staggering progress, with huge encircling movements capturing mind-boggling numbers of Russian troops. 250,000 at Bialystok, Minsk, 300,000 at Smolensk, nearly 700,000 at Kiev, and again at Vyazma.
I just realized that my mic's been muted. Nobody fucking told me. Because the Russians had zero war strategy, and they relied completely on numbers. Stalin was very, very, what's the word? He was very narcissistic and very in the idea that he was like, oh, we have the biggest army in the world, which was, at the time was true, but they just didn't have any kind of strategy. Their whole strategy was just throwing bodies at the Germans.
And Bryansk. Leningrad was put under a siege that would last an insufferable 4 years. The invasion of Russia had been Hitler's main ideological goal from the beginning, and his hatred for the ethnic peoples there was now unleashed in all its fury. The Eastern Front of the Second World War was brutal for all that endured it. The Germans were now inside of Moscow, and that's it. It's all over. But then it happened. It got cold. Stupid cold. Hitler had hoped the Soviets would give up before winter, but they kept fighting. His commanders
went down a 9/11 rabbit hole yesterday.
Wait for the winter and wait until spring? No. Keep going. But oil is literally freezing inside our vehicles. That's fine. Keep going. We're having to leave the corpses of our frozen horses by the side of the road so we can still find our way in the snowdrift. perfectly normal. Keep going. Hitler hadn't given his millions of men winter clothing and supplies because he thought he really should have won by now. Then, Stalin
like
pulled
the
in troops from the
conspiracy one.
Siberian front,
I know.
specially trained to fight in the extreme cold. And the
I mean, my idea about 9/11 has always been the large amounts of American intervention in the Middle East, as well as imperialistic behavior, led to our adversaries of those imperialistic actions to retaliate. And then we all just sat there with a surprised Pikachu face when after destabilizing the Middle East, a group decided to retaliate against us.
The Germans were no match. They were now being pushed back.
I love, actually, you were showing me the that old Reddit AMA of people talking about 9/11 as it happened. That shit was wild. That was wild. I read that. That shit was insane. Especially because as it was happening, nobody knew what was going on. So, like, it was a lot of just from the forum something awful. I think so. I think you sent that to me while I was at work one day. Check out the Howard Stern show from that day. I might do that here in a second. We'll finish the World War II stuff, and then I'll look at some 9/11 stuff.
They had no choice but to dig in and wait for winter to end. Germany's victories were staggering, and Japan was eager not to miss the victory bus. Their war in China had come to a standstill, but they wanted to keep expanding.
Last night, I went on I started going on a binge of these oversimplified videos, but I watched the one on the Russian Revolution, and it was pretty interesting.
Their sphere of influence and getting those sweet, sweet raw materials. They began making plans to expand southward, but there was a problem. Southeast Asia was heavily colonized by America and Great Britain. It was also full of ocean. Ocean meant naval combat, and there was no way the Japanese Navy could stand up to the US and the UK. So they thought, wouldn't it be nice if we could destroy their navies before we begin our conquest? And so it was. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise air raid on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and inflicted a huge amount of damage. They also attacked British colonies in Southeast Asia. Roosevelt had no choice but to declare war on Japan, and so did Churchill. Hitler then declared war on America, even though he totally didn't have to. The attack on Pearl Harbor seemed like a big Japanese victory, but they didn't attack any of the naval repair yards, fuel storage tanks, or the submarine base, meaning the Pacific Fleet would be up and running again pretty soon. In the meantime, though,
But no, Finn, I was talking about earlier, it's crazy to me how militant and imperialist Japan was pre-World War II or going into World War II, and how much, like, after the atomic bomb hit, that they just demilitarized. Like, it happened rapidly when you really think about it. Because World War II was, like, what, in the 40s? So, like, by the, like, 1960s to 70s, Japan was, like, a completely different country. In just, like, 20 to 30 years. It's wild.
Japanese were able to begin their conquest. They took Guam, the Gilbert Islands, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. They forced Thailand to join them so they could march their troops through the Malaya. They swept through Singapore.
I think
North Borneo,
he briefed over the massacre of Nanjing in this video, but he didn't.
Australia
he doesn't like explain it in depth. Which, to be fair, I have to be careful because of TOS stuff. But yeah, it's NSFL. Okay.
It had been as staggering as the Germans.
Oh, not safe for life. Yeah, I got you.
And it reinforced the Japanese idea that this
it's probably not safe for stream. If I were...
It was a divine war which they were destined to win, but their victories had been based on speed, not power, and power would eventually catch up with them. For now, though, in all occupied nations, the people suffered. persecution.
When you tell me
forced
don't
labor,
look it up, it makes me
punishments
want to look
for
it
any
up.
who spoke
I'll
out
probably
against
look it
their
up off
occupiers.
stream.
In Europe, the Nazis were rounding up ethnic minorities and other unwanted groups and individuals. In particular, millions of Jewish people would suffer through the terrible events of the Holocaust. Brave resistance movements rose up in defiance of their invaders, while the people held out for hope. And hope was coming. Winter was over, and Hitler could continue his push eastward. But this time, he switched up his strategy. He wanted to focus on the south. His plan was to cut off the Russian armies in the Caucasus, an area full of oil, and then invade the Caucasus and take all the oil. His forces moved across the north with ease, and Hitler got cocky. He rerouted the 4th Panzer Army south early, leaving the 6th Army to complete the encircling movement alone. To do so, the 6th Army had to reach and take the key Soviet city of Stalingrad. The Russians defended it fiercely, and Stalingrad saw some of the harshest fighting of the entire war. The Soviets held up the German advance for 5 months as they battled in the war-torn city, which
5 fucking months.
bought them valuable time. When the Germans had first launched their invasion a year earlier, the Soviets had moved their factories to the east. Those factories had been building a butt-ton of tanks and aircraft and getting the Soviet army up to scratch. Now, it was ready. Stalin gathered his new and improved forces around the city, and in an attack that resembled Hitler's own encirclement tactics, they began surrounding the 6th Army. Hitler's commanders came to him and said, "Hey, maybe we should retreat." But Hitler said, "No, you stay."
See, it was funny because after the industrialization of war, because you have to remember too that the Soviet Union wasn't super industrialized. I mean, they were, but not up to par with the rest of the world. Going into World War II, and then after Stalin had taken control of the Soviet Union, that the industrialization ramped up. So they ended up they had a lot of people, they had a whole lot of bodies, but the equipment for war wasn't quite there neither. That was another factor. But then finally, once they got tanks and fighters and some of the stuff that other powers were utilizing, things started to kind of go in their favor.
The entire 6th Army was trapped and had to surrender. With complete air superiority, the Soviets started pushing westward. For Stalin, it was a resounding victory. For Hitler, an absolute catastrophe. Things also weren't looking too good for Hitler elsewhere. With America now in the war, Allied bombing over German cities reached devastating levels. In Africa, the British had pushed Rommel back again. Then they were pushed back again, and finally, after a decisive battle at El Alamein, and with American and British troops arriving in the west, the Germans and Italians were squeezed out of Africa. Japan was also already seeing its rapid success being turned around. They attempted to take the island of Midway, but the US Navy was ready for the attack, and they sank Japan's carrier. Actually, they sank a lot of them. It was a battle from which the Japanese Navy would never recover. British, Indian, and Chinese troops held the line in the harsh jungle terrain of Burma, and the Japanese suffered losses in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. They began to realize they were not invincible. With the Axis out of Africa, the Allies had to decide their next move. Churchill still wanted...
By the way, I'm not saying that the Soviet Union was not industrialized during that time. They were, just they didn't have the resources that some of the other territories had until late stage in World War II. So
to attack from the south, while the Americans preferred a full sea invasion in northern France. All right, said the Americans.
Also, them becoming part of the Allies was a big thing too, because I mean they had back support from other countries. So
Americans will do it your way. Allied forces successfully landed in Sicily and began moving north. They also carried out bombing raids over Rome. The thing was, many of the people in Sicily had relatives living in America, and they greeted the American troops quite warmly. With the war reaching home territory, most Italians just weren't that into it, and Mussolini was suddenly very unpopular. He was voted out by his own fascist Grand Council and was toppled from power. Italy immediately began negotiations for surrender. Hitler wasn't surprised and had already sent reinforcements southward. In an operation he ironically called Operation Axis, German troops quickly disarmed Italian troops in the north. The Allies continued fighting the Germans up through Italy, but then winter set in, meaning mud, and everything slowed to a halt. All right, said the Americans, let's do it our way as well. Germany had made itself a lot of enemies, and millions of Allied troops had been gathering in England as factories worked around the clock producing the war material needed for a super crazy massive, the likes of which the world has never seen before, invasion of Europe. The Germans knew an Allied invasion would come, but they didn't know where it would land. Thanks to Allied deception tactics, they thought there was a pretty good chance it would come at Calais, but the Allies were really going to land in Normandy because it was less fortified and the beaches were nicer. Under the careful planning of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the invasion that had been long in the making was just about ready to go. Just one thing was preventing the launch: the British weather. For a short while, everyone sat around waiting for a decent day, and then it came. On the night of June 5th, over 1,000 bombers took off and raided coastline defenses, while paratroopers were dropped inland in a bit of a chaotic operation, tasked with sabotaging defenses and capturing key bridges to stop any German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Early the next morning, the barrage came, as Allied ships fired a huge number of shells at the German fortifications, and then the landings. The Americans at Utah and Omaha, the British at Golden Sword, and the Canadians at Juneau. It was a tremendous struggle with a great loss of life, particularly at Omaha, but the Allied troops captured the beaches and the landings were a success. Then they began their movements inland. They took the port of Cherbourg and the city of Caen. The Americans moved south to capture Brittany. Then, in a massive disaster for the Germans, British and Canadian troops from the north and Americans from the south trapped the German 7th Army in a near wipeout encircling movement. In August, Allied troops landed in the south of France to little resistance. On one beach, all they found was a Frenchman handing out champagne. Paris was liberated and the Germans were pushed out of France as the Allies entered Belgium. In the Far East, the Allies started to push the Japanese out of Burma, as the Americans launched a two-pronged offensive in the Pacific. In the south, General MacArthur led the push to liberate the Philippines, while General Nimitz oversaw the brutal island-hopping campaign. American forces had to make hard-fought landing after hard-fought landing on fiercely defended small islands as they moved steadily towards the Japanese mainland. The Japanese believed that the greatest thing a person could do was to die in battle, and the most dishonorable act was to surrender. As a result, they fought ferociously to the very end, and the closer the Americans got to the mainland, the more ferocious the resistance became. In February 1945, the Americans captured the island of Iwo Jima, and an intense firebombing campaign of Japan's wooden cities began. The Allies suffered some setbacks trying to liberate the Netherlands, but they were making progress and were now threatening the industrial heartland of Germany. Hitler's health, both mentally and physically, was rapidly deteriorating. Things were looking bad, and he was desperate. He said, "We need to turn this thing around, and I have just the trick. Remember a few years back when we blitzkrieged through the Ardennes and trapped the Allied forces in Belgium? Well, I'm going to do the exact same thing. Again." He gathered his forces and tried to pound them through the Ardennes. He used up the remainder of Germany's strength and resources, and he managed to create quite a nice bulge. He also trapped some American forces in the Belgian town of Bastogne. The Germans sent the trapped Americans a message saying, "Surrender or be annihilated." When it was read out to the commanding officer, he said, "They want to surrender? No, sir, they want us to surrender." Nuts! And that's what they sent off as their official reply. General Patton's Third Army then managed to break the siege from the southwest, and the Germans were pushed back. Hitler's last-ditch attempt had failed, and what followed was a total collapse of the German forces. The Allies pushed into Germany from both sides. The Soviet Union took Warsaw and kept pushing to Berlin. In his bunker, Hitler realized all hope was lost. Berlin fell, and with it, Hitler's dreams of a great German empire. Two of the Axis nations had been knocked out, one to go. The Americans began their assault on Okinawa, the last island before they would reach the Japanese mainland. The desperate Japanese fought hard, launching kamikaze attacks on the US ships. The citizens of Okinawa suffered through the terrible fighting, but in 2 months, the island was captured. The Allies now had to make a choice: either continue the devastating struggle up the Japanese mainland, or they could try to coerce the Japanese into surrendering now. In July, the first successful atomic bomb test took place in New Mexico, and the destructive weapon was ready for use. America and the UK were also seeing the Soviet Union not so much liberating as occupying its captured territories, and so they wanted to put on a show of force. On August 6th, the A-bomb fell on Hiroshima. Then, on the 9th, Nagasaki. The cities were reduced to rubble, and for the people living there, it was a terrible fate. But for the Allies, it achieved their main aim. In September, the Emperor announced Japan's surrender, saying the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. After 6 years, war was finally over. The Allies occupied Japan for 8 years. The Emperor was allowed to keep his position, but General MacArthur made sure this picture was printed in the Japanese press, to display to the Japanese people that their Emperor was not the divine, powerful being they had believed. Germany was divided between America, the UK, France, and the Soviet Union. In 1949, the Allied sectors were united into West Germany. The Second World War had been more terrible and destructive than the first. In its aftermath, two major superpowers with two very different ideologies had come out victorious, and the tension between the two of them would create a new kind of war. A very, very cold one. Wow, Churchill, that looks just like me. And your app is doing really well. And this quesadilla you made is to die for. How'd you learn to do all this?
Yeah, shit is wild, dude. shit is crazy. So it kind of makes you wonder how much different things would have been if the decision would have been to invade Japan and send ground troops to attack. I mean, I don't know if it would have changed that much historically. I feel like Japan still would have lost. Uh, but I guess more people would have died. I don't know. The atomic bomb was just such a fucking. Um, mm. I mean, it fucked them up. I think it taught everyone a valuable lesson about just how fucking powerful the nuclear weapons are. I think. Like, I mean, if it wasn't for that, there's no guarantee that nuclear war wouldn't have happened later. That's a bad take. I don't know. We've always known how powerful they are. I'm dumb. 20 normal looking pictures with disturbing backstories. The 9/11 thing, yeah. There was a really good video about I'm trying to think. Was it from Second Thought? Um I want to say Second Thought did a video on the Middle East. It was pretty good. No, it wasn't Second Thought. Have you watched the French Brothers documentary on 9/11? Negative. Is it on YouTube? Oh, it's just there's just clips from it. That's crazy. Hold on, let me check something. I think this is the video that I'll watch. And it's very interesting because I think it very much explains not only what happened as far as 9/11 goes, but it also explains everything leading up to the destabilization
East,
and
the part of Asia that Europeans see as the middle of what they see as the East. Sort of arbitrary. Whatever. We call it the Middle East. This part of the world is literally where civilization started. Right here in modern-day Iraq. And over the years, the borders here have been redrawn many times as empires have ebbed and flowed through this region. By the way, I didn't make this time-lapse. A very talented YouTuber did, and he deserves a medal for it. Or perhaps just a new patron. Thanks, man. Anyway, the most recent carving up of this region happened by European powers. The French, the British, the Russians. I mean, are we surprised? No. Like, of course it was the British, of course it was the French, of course it was Europeans, of course. The lines they drew didn't really take into account language or ethnicity or regional identity. They just sort of sliced it all up amongst themselves and said, these are our new regions of power in the Middle East. Eventually those European powers left, but the lines they drew stuck around and became the skeleton for what the borders look like today. And this is where our story starts. In the 1930s, here in the modern Middle East. At this point, across the ocean, there was this growing superpower that had spent the last century moving west, taking over this whole continent and beyond deep into the Pacific Ocean. We've talked about that a bit. But things were changing. The world had just fought a brutal world war that was fought with new weapons that were powered by this new important substance, oil. Germany lost that war, in part because they didn't have access to enough oil to keep up with this new style of warfare that relied a lot more on machines. The young superpower realized that access to this stuff would determine who would be powerful and who would not. So they stopped looking west for a moment and turned east, with hopes of finding the fuel they needed to build their power. The US presence in the Middle East started with one little dot, right here. But soon that dot would expand into a sprawling network of alliances, covert attacks, flows of weapons, money, and the building of innumerable bases, and eventually turning into full-on ground wars. This is how the US stole the Middle East.
Ready and willing to employ all means necessary.
Okay, so it's the 1930s, and the US doesn't have a significant presence in the Middle East at this point. But that's about to change, because there's a company based in California that wants to explore this vast desert for oil.
11,000 miles from San Francisco, there lies a primeval desert, a mass of drifting sand and sun-baked earth, 1/3 the size of the United States.
This was sort of a risky decision for the California company because, first off, they had no idea if there was actually any oil here.
They knew it would mean sinking into the desert the money of thousands of stockholders in a project that might well end in complete loss.
And second off, this desert was a part of a very hardcore religious kingdom.
The fact that Mecca is the source and the shrine of Islam gives Saudi Arabia a central place in the Islamic and therefore the Arab world.
That was home to the holiest sites in Islam, run by a dogmatic royal family that did not like outsiders, especially non-believing Westerners. But even still, the king of the Desert Kingdom eventually gives the California company permission to explore almost 1 million square kilometers of this desert looking for oil. And after a few years, the bet paid off. And on March 3rd, 1938, in this little patch of coastal desert, they struck gold. Well, actually they struck oil, but it might as well have been gold.
No, it was more valuable than gold.
So throughout the 30s and 40s, American oil executives, workers, and their families started flocking to the Middle East, establishing the first significant American presence in the region. They set up little cities around the oil operation that were little slices of America, full of the deepest sinful behavior, like allowing women to drive and the consumption of alcohol.
Here is another American colony, complete with air-conditioned houses, 2 hospitals, and an outdoor movie theater.
This is the sort of stuff that is very off limits in Saudi Arabia. It's literally illegal at this point. So you have a lot of Saudis who are not happy about their government letting the Americans in to behave however they want. But the oil kept flowing, and soon the US government goes to the royal family and says, listen, the oil is flowing better than ever, this is awesome. How about we build a little military base attached to our little oil city so that we can, you know, protect you and protect us and protect the oil and stuff. And the Saudis are like, okay, having the great Satan come to our country for oil is one thing, but letting them set up a full-on military base on our soil, and especially when like everyone in our country is not happy with their presence in the first place. But, said the royal family, all of this oil is really valuable and it's really nice and we're getting super rich, so they're like, yeah, sure, set up the base.
They were like, all the Saudis were like, we gotta get these Americans out of here. We don't like American intervention. Basically all the citizens, but the government was like, come on, dude, we're making so much money, dude. Like, come on. Like, we're making all this money. Can we not just sell a little bit of oil? Like, yeah, they suck, but like, we're making so much money.
But there was one stipulation that the Saudis had for the Americans. You are not allowed to literally plant a flag, no flagpoles of the United States. You cannot put your flag anywhere on this base. Instead, you can put a little plaque on the side of the building so that your flag is not literally on our soil. And that was the deal. And that's exactly what happened. The US sets up its first military operation in the Middle East in the form of a landing strip that is right next to this oil field. Okay, so all of this infrastructure that the Americans were building required someone to build it. They needed a construction company. And there was one construction company that the Americans really liked that helped them build their oil city and their base. This company was founded and run by a guy named Mohammed. Now listen, do you think I'm really giving you the backstory on the construction company that built the air base in the oil city just because that's interesting and I like to talk about construction? No, this is actually very relevant to the story, and you will see why very soon. So the Americans and the Saudis are having this forbidden oil bromance, and it's going really well, and the oil is flowing, everyone's getting rich. And meanwhile, the rest of the Middle East is looking at Saudi Arabia and they're like, dude, WTF, why are you like in bed with America? And like, why are you letting them set up a landing strip in your country? And the Saudi royals are like, do you realize how rich we're getting right now? Like, if you were in our position, you would do the same thing, Egypt. Okay, so it's the 1950s, and let's get back to Mohammed, the construction guy. His company, by this point, is thriving. The American presence in oil land is just exploding, and he is building all of the stuff for it. And so this guy has a giant business. And he starts to have children. Well, in fact, he had a lot of children, like 54 children, because he had 22 wives, because that is a thing in Saudi Arabia to this day. Anyway, the point is, one of Mohammed's sons is named Osama. I told you this was going to be relevant. Okay, a reminder that Saudi Arabia is not the entire Middle East. So, I'm going to leave the Osama bin Laden cliffhanger for a moment to tell you what else was going on in the Middle East at this time. Remember that it was the hunt for oil that brought the US to Saudi Arabia originally. But now, in the 50s and 60s, there was a new reason for the US to think about the Middle East. And that reason is because there's another big superpower that has nuclear weapons, called the Soviet Union, who is coming into the region and saying to everyone, come join Team Communism. And the US is like, hold my beer. So in addition to oil, the US is now involved in trying to not let the Soviet Union have any power in this region. Over in Iran, there was a democratically elected leader that the US didn't like. They thought he was maybe a little too friendly with the Soviet Union. So they worked together with the British to literally overthrow the government of Iran so that they could install a dictatorial leader that was more friendly to the United States. Little side note here, the airport that I fly out of here in DC is named after the guy who like gave the go-ahead for this coup in Iran, John Foster Dulles. So I'm reminded of the whole Iran thing every time I fly. So the US has its oil thing, it's now involved in trying to prop up a dictator in Iran. There's another big thing happening that brings the US into the region, which is that the newly declared state of Israel is starting to piss off its neighbors and starting to look to the US for support. And the US gladly offers it, seeing Israel as a friendly nation in the region that could be a big proponent of US interests. So the US starts to fund Israel with tons of money and fighter jets and all of these things to help them fight their wars against their Arab neighbors. There was a debate happening in the United States on whether or not they should actually do all of this to support Israel so intensely, because they knew if they did, they were going to piss off all of the neighbors in the Middle East. And all of the neighbors are the ones who had the oil. In the end, the US did decide to support Israel. And with that came a major backlash from all of these oil-producing countries in the neighborhood.
It is a crisis of such proportion that we probably haven't even begun to grasp it yet as far as the country is concerned.
Scenes like this are becoming all too common on both sides of the Atlantic. But for America, they are more ominous. They tell the Arabs that their oil weapon is wounding America, the country that supports and supplies their enemy Israel.
Eventually, this backlash against supporting Israel kind of calmed down. There was some peace talks. And anyway, let's get back to Mohammed, the construction guy, and his son Osama, because this is where it really starts to heat up.
And it is this world of religious authority and deeply rooted traditions that is now being challenged by the wealth of oil and the Western invasion it has brought.
So it's now the 70s, and Mohammed bin Laden, the construction guy, is now insanely rich. His construction company is giant, his 54 children are also rich, and his son Osama is growing up and is in his 20s.
You gotta be pretty damn rich for all your 54 children to still be rich, by the way. Just saying.
And is looking around at all of this stuff happening in Iran and in Israel, and is starting to feel really uncomfortable with the notion of his family being so supportive of American presence in the Middle East, and his government, this religious kingdom, home of Mecca and Medina, being so okay with the US so embedded in the Middle East at this point. These are ancient, holy lands. Why is my government and my family supporting this great Satan superpower coming in and becoming so involved in the Middle East? So bin Laden sets out on a lifelong quest to fight back against these superpowers, not just the US, but also the Soviet Union, invading the Middle East. He heads to Afghanistan, where the Soviet Union is invading Afghanistan, trying to take it over. Bin Laden wants to fight back. By the way, the same year, in Iran, that dictator that the US put in gets overthrown in a giant religious revolution that gets rid of the old dictator that the US liked and puts in a religious government headed by this guy, Ayatollah Khomeini. This new government takes a bunch of Americans hostage and starts off hating the United States. And I mean, can you blame them? If someone overthrew the person I elected, I would be pretty pissed too. So anyway, back to bin Laden. He arrives to Afghanistan with a few things. Number one, a bunch of money. Remember, his family's like super rich. He also comes with construction infrastructure because he's like a construction guy. Like his family knows construction and infrastructure building. But most importantly, he comes with an obsessive dedication to fighting back against any superpower that is invading the Middle East. So Osama joins in with all of these rebel fighters who are fighting back against the Soviet Union. And they fight a long, brutal war. By the way, the US was secretly loving this, loving that the Soviet Union was getting like beat back by these like rebel fighters. So they end up sending loads of weapons and money and support to these fighters, something that will come back to bite them a few decades later. Eventually, Osama and the Afghan fighters beat back the Soviet Union. It was 10 brutal years of war, and by the end, these fighters were battle-hardened. Osama was now completely dedicated to his cause of fighting back against superpowers who were coming into the Middle East. So he returns back to Saudi Arabia, where he starts raising money and awareness for his new group that he started while he was in Afghanistan. It's called Al-Qaeda, and the mission of the group is to protect Islam through violently striking back against big superpowers coming into the Middle East. And Saudi Arabia's like, Osama, like, do you have to do this, dude? Do you realize how rich we're getting? Like, Saudi princes are living on yachts in the south of France and like flying in their private jets, and they're like, dude, chill. Like, it's fine, we get it, we don't like the United States, but like, can you like maybe chill? Our partnership with the United States is actually turning out to be really great, and I know, yeah, they're really into Israel and they're really bad and everything, but like, they buy our oil and they give us weapons and we're like doing just fine over here. Osama doesn't chill, and the Saudi government eventually takes away his passport, not letting him leave, and told him to hush up with all the anti-American holy war talk. So Osama finds another plan to maybe win back the heart of the royals. Saudi Arabia has a next-door neighbor named Iraq who was run by Saddam Hussein, who Osama sees as a really bad Muslim, totally secular and brutal, and he's just like not a good guy. Saddam is also cashing in on the oil boom. He's building big palaces and statues of himself all over the country. Oh yeah, and he also used the oil money to build a giant army, like the fourth biggest in the world. With this massive army, Saddam decided that he could maybe multiply his oil reserves if he popped down to invade this little tiny country of Kuwait, where there's also loads of oil. This sort of freaked the Saudis out. If Saddam, with his giant army, could grab Kuwait, what would stop him from marching right across this desert into Saudi?
I kind of glanced over it earlier, but just keep in mind too, during Afghanistan, trying to fight off the Soviet Union, with Osama bin Laden over there. America funding them with weapons and equipment and just everything else. Was a complete and utter oversight, because yeah, like it was kind of an enemy of my enemy situation, I'm sure is how they saw it. But ultimately, as soon as they were done with the Soviet Union, you don't think they were going to come for the U.S.?
Saudi Arabia. So there's this moment that it's like the moment of infamy of this whole thing, where Osama goes to the Saudis and he says,
"I volunteer as tribute."
He doesn't actually say, I volunteer in tribute. That was Hunger Games.
I believe we have a volunteer.
But he effectively says, I have me and my battle-hardened men who can go in and fight against Saddam and defend the kingdom. And the Saudis are like, no, we're not gonna let this ragtag group of rebel fighters fight off the fourth largest army in the world. And Osama's like, well, we beat the Soviets. They're a big army with nuclear weapons and everything. And the Saudis are like, yeah, because you hid in the hills in caves in Afghanistan. Prince Sultan literally told bin Laden verbatim, quote, there are no caves in Kuwait. And then he asks them, what will you do when he lobs the missiles at you with chemical and biological weapons? Osama's response, we will fight them with our faith. And the Saudis are like, awkward? Sorry, dude, Instead, the king met with somebody else that he thought would make a much better fit than bin Laden and his faith fighters. Dick Cheney had flown to Saudi Arabia the day after Saddam had invaded Kuwait. At this point, the bromance between the US and Saudi Arabia had cooled a little bit, as Saudi had gotten more and more flack for being in bed with the US. But even despite this, he told Cheney to come with as much force and as quickly as he could. And that is exactly what Dick Cheney did.
Ready and willing to employ all means necessary.
The US went insane here. They recruited 37 other countries, and then they sent more firepower in terms of ships and bombers and troops and all this stuff than you and I could ever imagine. It was insanity. And they totally crushed Saddam. Within a few weeks, they had pushed Saddam back and completely won over the hearts of the royals. The bromance is back in business. So now you have these Saudis that are beaming at the Americans for helping them fight off Saddam. And you have a bunch of bases that the US set up to mount this attack. Way more than before. The US came with all of this firepower and manpower and bases and artillery, And then they just sort of never left. Something that really pissed off a lot of Saudis who were very uncomfortable with US presence to begin with. But the guy who was most pissed off than anyone in the Middle East at this point, Osama bin Laden, who had not only been rejected by his own country, but then who got chosen instead, but the great Satan, the United States, a power that Osama had built his entire life fighting against. So Osama bin Laden starts to double down on his original mission. He leaves Saudi Arabia and begins coordinating very precise attacks that could really only be coordinated by a guy who was good at technical details of a construction company and who had lots of money to fund it. He carries out attacks against the United States all around the world. And by the late 90s, he starts planning the attack that would change our world forever.
We're setting up an ad hoc.
So this is just the first half of the story. What happens next is something that we're all kind of familiar with. In fact, I think we're all still kind of processing the US presence in the Middle East today and how that all went down. But it deserves taking a look at, and I'm not going to do that right now. I want to make a separate video for Iraq and Afghanistan and Israel and Iran and dive into each of these cases to show.
Also, this very much goes with the idea that capitalism is completely impossible without imperialism.
How the US presence in the Middle East is not just about oil. In fact, oil is becoming less and less of a vital aspect of the US presence as we have alternative sources of this sort of energy. Instead, our presence in the Middle East has become a fixture of how we think about foreign policy and how we think about the map. It's become so embedded in our military doctrine and in our foreign policy doctrine that it's proving to be really hard to think about how we could ever get out. Thank you everyone for watching this video. Man, the Middle East. The Middle East. It's a complicated place, and this is just a very broad overview. And like I said, I want to go deeper into each of these case studies because there's so much more to cover with each of these stories. Anyway, that is to come. Stay tuned for that. Thank you, Skillshare, for sponsoring today's video. Big fan of Skillshare, big fan of online learning. Skillshare is a giant repository.
But of course, the part that he didn't get to is the fact that after all this went down, and after 9/11 happened, and we were attacked by Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, we decide that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. So instead of fighting, even fighting the forces that did 9/11, we're like, oh, we're going to send more forces into Iraq because somehow they have weapons of mass destruction. Even though everyone knows it's not true. So, I think what's more interesting than, I mean, like 9/11 was awful. And the people that died in 9/11 did not deserve to die in 9/11. I mean, obviously, it's tragic. But it's kind of hard to look at the events of, like, what the U.S. did and not go, like, we kind of had it coming. People are still dying, yeah. Like, and I'll say, like, at the same time, like, I think it's sad and it's tragic, but at the same time, you, like, looking at it, it's like, damn, dude, like, yeah, it's unfortunate. And they denied, and then they go out, yeah, and then they denied paying for health care of the first sponsors that were there and have cancer now. Exactly. It's fucking wild. Like, it's insane, and it all, again, was in the interest of oil, because the whole reason that they propagated lies to go to Iraq instead of Afghanistan. I mean, we were obviously fighting a war in Afghanistan, but to focus more on Iraq and Saddam Hussein is because Iraq was rich with resources. And it was all about oil, and it was all about money. Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction. There was no reason for us to go to Iraq. Those buildings were so old, those people were breathing in asbestos, jet fuel, dirt, debris, and to be honest, people, exactly. It's wild, dude. It makes me mad. It really does. Like, it infuriates me in the sense of like all of this shit. Like, people gotta die because because capital owners need to continue to make profit and need to everlastly expand their profit, so, and exploit. I know you're really young when it happened, but that day was one of the most vivid memories of my childhood. I was actually, yeah, I was really young when it happened. I was in kindergarten, so I just remember mom pulling us out of school. I didn't know exactly understand the whole shebang of what was going on. Yo. Why did it start in the middle? Oh, one more thing before we start this. It also is, my point with that was to show like the kind of the stuff leading up to 9/11, because I think it's very important. It doesn't get talked about enough. Like, people are just like, yeah, 9/11 is tragic. Okay, but like, why did it happen? You know. And I want to say it's not I'm not justifying the people that did 9/11 neither, obviously. Religious radicalization is just as fucking bad, if not a worse problem than imperialist occupation.
In Bolivia tonight, a team of mountain climbers is trying to reach that Eastern Airlines jet which crashed into the side of a mountain outside La Paz. The wreckage of Eastern Flight 980 lies buried in a giant glacial snowdrift.
There were absolutely no good guys in that situation. You're 100% right. America did bad. Afghanistan did bad. Al-Qaeda did bad. It was all, no good guys. Except the people who tried to help the wounded and dead, exactly. This is, okay, one more thing. I'm sorry, I'm pausing. The thing that bothers me, too, is, like, there's so many interviews from presidents, just in the past 10 years, that will have the nerve to say, like, America doesn't get involved in fucking, global, global affairs. Like, they'll basically say, like, America doesn't get involved. We don't go to war with everybody. We don't meddle in other places. That is not true. Everyone knows it's not true. I think there was a quote from Obama when he was talking about, like, America doesn't get involved, doesn't meddle in other lands except for when it's a good thing. which is laughable. Laughable.
There is not much hope that there are any survivors.
Boeing 727.
On a quiet New Year's Day in 1985, Eastern Airlines Flight 980 was doing its regularly scheduled international flight.
Production value is
While this flight
fantastic.
was a staple for Eastern Airlines.
Before I play this, is there any like blood or gore in it? I'm sure there's not, but I just wanted to make sure for Twitch TOS. Not so worried about YouTube. Okay.
It's not as commonly flown today. Flight 980's route on that day had departed in Asunción, Paraguay, and was scheduled to make its first stop in La Paz, Bolivia.
BS is good about paying TOS. Yeah, I mean, obeying YouTube TOS is one thing, because YouTube doesn't mind blood and gore, but Twitch does. So.
At Miami International Airport in the United States. As Flight 980 would depart at 5:57 p.m. local time in Asunción, Paraguay, everything would be business as usual.
Probably play that. Okay.
Throughout the duration of the
I
flight,
believe you. I just wanted to make sure.
Quiet. A mere 10 crew members and 19 passengers on an airplane designed to accommodate at least 130. As the hour and 40-minute flight duration passed, the flight was in its final leg towards El Alto International Airport in La Paz, Bolivia. On Flight 980's final approach towards El Alto, flight conditions, according to the incident report, were labeled as IMC. While this is just a fancy way of saying that the pilots were reliant on their instruments for navigation, this is to be expected when flying at night during a cloud cover. Nonetheless, where the story takes a disturbing turn is when you read the final transcripts. At 8:25 local time, 980 would ask for landing clearance from air traffic control. And after a back and forth and receiving the weather report, at 8:37, the pilot would confirm their descent to 18,000 feet, and with this final transmission and their reported crossing of the Dacon intersection, the plane would never be heard from again. As the night would unfold with further attempts to reach the plane, the following sunrise would lead to one of the most questionable investigations in aviation history.
So they were literally about to land?
For news outlets to pick up on the flight's disappearance.
What
After
the fuck?
subsequent attempts over the night to radio the flight, a search investigation involving the Bolivian government was launched, as it was in their jurisdiction. As information passed hands soon after, a missing passenger list was arranged, and there were quite a few that could easily set off a few red flags. For one, both the U.S. ambassador to Paraguay and his wife were listed as passengers of Flight 980. Until it was later discovered that Arthur Davis, the U.S. ambassador, had something come up last minute and didn't end up actually getting on board with his wife. Another interesting individual listed on the passenger list was the director of the United States Peace Corps, William Kelly. For context here, the Peace Corps programs are often used as a way of helping developing countries that remain friendly through a wide variety of volunteer programs. If someone had a politically driven message to deliver, targeting both the ambassador and a local Peace Corps director would definitely increase tensions. Flight 980 had been found crashed into the south side face of Mount Illimani. While the normal planned route would have had no problem with this mountain, this had indicated that something had caused the flight to drastically veer off course. In a later investigative incident report, it notes that they may have taken an alternative route to avoid weather in the area, but no correspondence with air traffic control seems to indicate any issue on board or any intent to change their route. Even more interesting, if you dig up some of the earliest newspaper coverage on this topic, the United Press International had reported that local villagers in the village of Cajoni had reported parts of the plane falling from the sky and a loud roar of thunder directly above them. While it is to be expected that the plane's impact would have caused some commotion, if you mapped it out, you'd be concerned as Cajoni was a full 9 miles away from where the plane had actually come to rest, and this would have also meant that the plane was headed in an entirely different direction for no discernible reason. Now, with the limited details I've shared thus far, you'd think that discovering the true nature of what happened on board would be a top priority. And something you need to know about investigating any flight crash is that the first order of business is to retrieve the flight's black box. And while what I've shown you might raise an eyebrow, generally the best course of action is to suspend your disbelief until the most important piece of information can be analyzed. A black box is standard in any commercial flight and is set to record all conversation of the cockpit, as well as recording the control inputs put into the plane. Considering that the flight obviously veered off course, something obviously caused it to do so, whether it be an external force or human error. And when it comes to these black boxes, they're designed to be incredibly durable, meaning that the next course of action to figure out what had happened to the plane would include hiking up 19,000 feet to the crash site. As the investigation would continue, more details would emerge that would make this situation questionable at the very best. With the three parties responsible for this investigation being the Bolivian government, as it was their territory, the Peruvian government, as the flight had originated from there, and the NTSB, or National Transport Safety Board for the United States, as it was their plane. As they all met, they just couldn't seem to make it up the mountain to properly investigate the scene. However, that being said, local mountain climbers were able to make it up without any oxygen, as they didn't require acclimation, unlike government authorities. These mountain climbers were Bernardo Guarachi, Juan Ando, and Freddy Ortiz, who managed to reach the site before anybody else. When they arrived at the crash site, they reported no survivors, along with no human remains. Of the items they claimed to bring back with them, it included the pilot's personal belongings, the original flight plan, but the black box was apparently nowhere to be found. This was despite the fact that the tail piece of wreckage had still been intact. And for reference, this is usually where a black box is stored in case of a crash. When Bernardo spoke to the press, he stated that it was unsafe for any further expedition until the dry season. But by calling off the search effort,
So maybe someone survived and took the box? Someone survived the crash? Maybe?
It's like this, it had one unique consequence.
That's weird that they didn't find any remains and any human remains, though. That's strange.
Would effectively bury the crash site in meters and meters of snow. Government officials seemed to echo this notion, as the search effort was canceled about a week later, with no government entity
It just gets
showing
weirder.
any interest in the crash after this announcement, leaving the families with little to no closure. In hindsight, this looks incredibly shady, as one of the final discoveries made by Bernardo Guarachi.
It also depends on the time from the crash to the guys climbing the mountain. Because if it was really, really slow, like, I guess decomposition, how long does decomposition even take? I doubt the bodies would have time to decompose. Maybe the cold has something to do with it. You would still find bodies. So that's what I would think too. It's weird.
And his team was that the plane's cargo included nearly $1 million in poached reptile skins.
Notice the poached reptile skins?
During 1985, no other reported investigations were made.
Did they say that they found... Hold on, I think I was...
reptile skins.
Have been smuggling reptile skins. That's interesting. Okay. That's interesting.
During 1985, no other reported investigations were made by the Bolivian government. And when Bolivia had finally released their accident report in September, they ultimately cited the area as inaccessible, and there was no mention of the contraband found on board at all. The official incident report concluded that this was a controlled flight into terrain for unknown reasons, and simply blamed it on the weather without much elaboration. However, it appears that Bolivia never made their own attempt to ever go up to the mountain, because citing the area as inaccessible.
To be fair, they didn't have an explanation, and they didn't have any kind of idea of what the skins were there for, or whether they were relevant. So I don't feel like in an official report it would make sense for them to include that.
This team included a native mountain climber by the name of Ronnie Abada, and while they echoed the report of no bodies or black box, they managed to get up to the site with no problems at all. By this time, searching was difficult as there was a fresh layer of snow cover from the following months. Ramon, not wanting to let the trip go to waste, took it upon himself.
But I guess is the point that he's trying to make it's kind of weird that Bolivia didn't investigate further?
When he had returned home, apparently the CEO of Eastern Airlines, Frank Borman, and another top management associate had learned of his expedition and privately asked him not to release any of the photos in exchange for additional money to be allocated to the families. As far as I'm aware, this footage was basically lost to time, and it took a while to track down, but that is what you're seeing right now. I will leave Ray's video in the description for a full watch through, as this unreleased film is basically the only footage that exists. Now, while Ray Valdez made it up the mountain in March, by July, Judith Kelly, the widow of William Kelly, who had also passed in the crash, had her own private expedition up the mountain. She took with her the same Bernardo Garacci from the first expedition as her guide. Once again, this expedition had no problems reaching the crash site, and once again, no bodies or black box could be located. However, this trip wasn't necessarily made in intention to recover evidence or dig through snow. The reason Judith Kelly hiked up this mountain was for her own closure. After she had returned home, she made it a point to press the NTSB further about a well-prepared investigation by professionals. And when they finally agreed to search the area, the report would leave us with far more questions than answers. This third expedition involved quite a few people, names being Greg Feith as the NTSB investigative lead, Bernardo Garacci, Alan and Mark Gerber, Royce Fitch, Jim Baker, and Al Arrington as the individuals scheduled to investigate the site. But leave it to the professionals to have one of the worst expeditions possible. For one, the group was given a total of $600 for the entire trip and forced to pay for everything else they needed out of pocket. The report notes that they were forced to bring their own climbing gear and food as they could not be guaranteed by Bolivia, and to top that off, they were given a total.
Okay, that's sketchy as fuck, dude. They're like, yeah, we'll let you do an investigation. We're just not gonna pay for it. You know? Good luck, nerds.
Of 3 days' notice prior to their trip, forcing them to prepare for everything last minute. On the first day of climbing, they had gone up 17,000 feet, only to realize that none of their gear had been transported by the Bolivian Red Cross, and instead had gone to their second base camp at 19,000 feet. As the sun set from the first day of climbing, they were forced to wait in the cold with no camping gear, while the Red Cross was going to deliver all of the rest of their gear. After waiting 2 more hours, the Red Cross had finally arrived, bringing with them 2 tents but no stoves or fuel to cook their food. And the report pathetically notes that they were barely able to defrost cold noodle soup that night. As a result of this mishap, one of the team members, Al Arrington, had developed pulmonary edema and was put onto oxygen. This forced Jim Baker and Al Arrington to turn around and have to head back down to the base of the mountain. The remaining members continued on the next morning, but not before Roy Fitch had fallen into a crevice, injuring him. Despite this injury, they pressed on, and after camping at the second base camp, they ascended to the crash site, which by then, another member, Mark Gerber, had developed pulmonary edema and deteriorated over the night. Something you need to understand about searching through the wreckage is that they were required to be physically capable to dig through snow to investigate the scene. By this time, only 3 out of the 7 were physically capable. That day, the report notes searching through various pieces of wreckage, and notably, they had found their first and only sign of blood out of all of the expeditions. It had been found on the metal portion of the pilot's shoulder harness in the cockpit. Despite all odds, Greg Feith had managed to find a key portion of the wreckage, that being the aft stairwell, which by now had become buried in 7 feet of snow. And in this aft stairwell portion, he had even located where the black box was supposed to be mounted, yet once again, no black box. After a day of searching, the investigation was called off, and just when you think things couldn't get any worse, the descent down the mountain was hampered with even more problems, as the group's reliance on the Red Cross would fail them once again. Greg Feith and Royce Fitch descended in one day. The others in the group had stayed behind and requested for fuel, stoves, and food to be delivered to the 17,000-foot base camp while they recovered. When the Red Cross had finally arrived, they instead brought 2 gallons of Kool-Aid and clothing. It's incredibly interesting just how many bad things these people had happen to them on this individual expedition. And furthermore, it's even more interesting that the NTSB never planned another follow-up. When everybody and their widow can investigate this plane crash, but a government agency just can't bother to spend...
Yo, at least bring me, like, some alcohol, dog. Alcohol will warm you up when it's cold. Like, you brought me Kool-Aid? Kool-Aid? Dude, what the fuck? Okay, I'm sorry.
And more than $600, it almost begs the question
Kool-Aid and
whether
britches.
or not something else was going on at Eastern Airlines. As time would pass, it would paint the situation surrounding Flight 980 in a far different light. For one, the contraband found at the crash site was simply a drop in the bucket compared to the shady back room that was Eastern Airlines as a whole. Because soon after Flight 980's crash, more and more headlines would begin to pop up regarding seizures of other contraband found on the flights to Miami. That contraband, in the vast majority of cases, being snow, and not the type of snow found on the top of Mount Illimani. Ground crews at airports working specific shifts were caught loading extra suitcases filled with nose candy into portions of the cargo hold, as well as other creative parts of the plane. In one instance at Eastern Airlines, a pilot had actually found about 15 kilos under his seat in April of 1984. According to George Jen, an ex-Eastern Airlines pilot who wrote a book on this subject, from mid-1984 until January 1989, a period of just over 4 years, official government records revealed that there were 2,723 pounds of snow, over a ton, and 826 pounds of flour seized by drug enforcement and U.S. Customs on Eastern aircraft flying into the United States. At the time, officials estimated that 20 to 25% of energy powder smuggled into the United States entered the country via Eastern. While the majority of this operation stemmed from Colombia, where flights were routed into Miami, we obviously know that other South American countries were in on this ordeal as well. Hence the Cayman skins from Flight 980 originating from Paraguay. Subsequent convictions would show that incoming bags to Miami filled with contraband would be unloaded by Eastern workers and set aside, where accomplices would later pick them up individually. Additionally, Eastern's involvement with money laundering for the cartel was also alleged. Jerry Loeb, who was an Eastern Airlines veteran pilot, testified that he was aware of at least 45 to 50 flights to Panama where the airliner was paid off to transport illegal funds on unmarked pallets. Hereafter, the money was deposited into Panama banks until it was wired into the US for legitimate investment. And in regards to Flight 980, had some of that money gone into the right pockets, that may have been the reason there was so little interest in investigating the crash. For perspective, when that ex-pilot had met with the FBI regarding the unmarked pallets being shipped to Panama, within 4 hours of submitting the report, Eastern had hired people to monitor him, and he was later fired.
It's all coming together now. Still doesn't explain. Oh, that actually does explain the no bodies. Because here's the thing: if the flight was just trafficked to haul drugs, and there were potentially no passengers, then that would explain no bodies. Except for the captain. Sounds like some sort of like cleanup job, is what it sounds like. Like they were in some shady shit and had to get rid of some stuff, or you know, blah blah blah. And they had a very specific location in which the plane would crash to prevent to give them excuses for further investigation. Because further investigation would lead into more of their shady shit. That's what I'm gathering.
Airlines would ultimately file for bankruptcy, but not before a series of highly questionable events that would lead them to being bought out for $606 million by a corporate raider by the name of Frank Lorenzo. Lorenzo would run the airliner into the ground, no pun intended, but not before looting $750 million in the company's assets for his other airliner. With every passing day from this point on, Eastern Airlines and the Flight 980 crash.
Also, it'd be really easy to fake passengers on a plane, like systems in place and stuff like that, given the time period and everything else, and how the security was with air flights. It'd be really easy to show that you were a passenger flight and that you had people on board, and not have anyone on board but the pilot.
Would fade in the memories of the public until 2016, when two individuals by the name of Isaac Stoner and Dan Futrell would find themselves browsing Wikipedia for a list of unrecovered flight recorders. Here they noticed that Flight 980 had listed the reason for non-recovery as terrain inaccessible. It would pique their interest as they would soon discover all of the questionable details surrounding the investigations. This would lead to the creation of their blog, Operation Thanapa, in which they would plan their own investigation to Mount Illimani. While they had done their research in this flight in a variety of ways, one of the newer avenues they also sought to research was contacting Bernardo Guaracci, who in a written interview with Outside Magazine would finally break his silence on what had actually happened on his first expedition in 1985.
Alright, so here's my theory. The pilot did not crash the plane. He landed it. Removed the black box. Blew up the plane to show it being crashed, to like give the illusion that the plane had been crashed. And then left with the black box. So I don't think the black box is there at all.
For one, he claims that the person responsible for sending him up the mountain was Royce Fitch, a U.S. diplomat, and if you recall, he was also present on the third expedition. According to his version of the story, Bernardo notes that there were footprints at their old campsite, suggesting that someone had followed them up the mountain. However, these footprints had not extended all the way up to the top, suggesting that they had turned around at some point. When Bernardo had returned from the summit, he claimed that he was detained by the Bolivian government, separated from his team, and searched thoroughly. After interrogating him once at the base camp, they took him back to the airport to interrogate him once again, where he claims one of the men there threatened him should he choose to speak about anything that had happened that day. If this is true, when you pair Bernardo's statement to the press, stating that they would have had to wait until April for another search, it almost seems like he was pressured into giving this statement. I mean, we know for one the area is both not inaccessible, and in March of that year, it was also safe to climb the mountain, as Ramon Valdez had done just that. We also need to understand that the Bolivian government had literally zero interest in investigating the scene at all. And with this collective statement from Bernardo 30 years later, it points to this entire situation wanting to be swept under the rug. Getting back to Isaac and Dan, who were planning their trip to Illimani in 2016, when they arrived in Bolivia, they had decided to search 3,000 feet below the crash site along the south face. As in 2006, it was reported that parts of the wreckage had begun to slide down the mountain. In their search, they would end up documenting a staggering amount of debris as well as some human remains. They also believed to have found parts of the black box as well as the magnetic tape that would have held the data inside. After they left, they took their findings with them at—
I don't believe it, buddy! It's all fake! It's all fake! There ain't no the real black box. They were planted there!
as they were not trusting of the local Bolivian government to investigate this new finding properly, but in doing so, they inadvertently broke an international law, taking evidence home. After waiting over a year for the Bolivian embassy to give the okay to investigate what they had found, they would be disappointed. Because on February 7th, 2017, as the NTSB had reported that the parts of the black box they had discovered were only some chip pieces of the outer casing, as well as another piece being the connective part to the pilot's headset. And the magnetic tape that they had found was not the right size and instead included an 18-minute recording of the television show I Spy. While this came up short, this whole situation once again highlights how poorly this was investigated in the first place.
Okay, my theory still stands. Even if there were people on the plane, he still could have done that exact thing and then destroyed the black box.
Furthermore, this mystery only goes deeper as we can't answer what happened to the black box, and that makes it impossible to understand what had happened to the plane definitively.
That's what I think. I think it was just straight up like a cover-up for sketchy shit.
Cohesive theory as to what happened to Flight 980. Well, for one, something you need to know about El Alto International Airport is that it isn't necessarily an easy airport to land at. It's a tiny target at a high altitude that, by many first-hand accounts, makes the approach incredibly difficult. And while pilot Campbell hadn't flown this route that many times, something else you need to know is that further flight reports from Eastern regarding the Omega navigation system aboard Flight 980 later reported having some issues as well. Don McClure, the chairman of the ALPA's Accident Investigation Board, had written a report regarding flights from Paraguay to Bolivia, noting that the Omega system had the potential to track about 4 miles off course. We know that the pilots were reliant on their instruments for navigation. However, 4 miles would not be nearly enough for the plane to strike the mountain, and it also wouldn't explain how debris had fallen over the village of Cajoni had they simply tracked from a different angle from the Dacon intersection. While I'd love to write this off simply as pilot failure, there's just an entire mess of other details that don't seem to make sense at all. For one, why was there not a single attempt to go up the mountain from the Bolivian government? We know that Royce Fitch hired Bernardo Garachi on behalf of the United States, but all the Bolivian government did was cite the area as inaccessible after 3 separate investigations reached the site. Number 2, who threatened Bernardo Garachi and who followed them up the mountain? Number 3, who is smuggling Yacare caiman skins, and why was that not included in the Bolivian report? Number 4, what caused parts of the plane to fall from the sky, given that this was almost 10 miles away? Number 5, why was the NTSB's expedition so poorly executed with no follow-up? And number 6, is it possible that the black box was recovered in an undisclosed expedition? While I'll admit all this stuff borders on conspiracy and the more likely scenario is that there was some navigational errors, there's still a lot of food for thought here. What we do know as a seed of truth here is that this airliner was in fact implicated in an operation of one or more cartels. And as you can imagine, whenever there's any involvement in that territory, the cartel's insane amount of wealth and control over governments can really open up the bounds of what is possible. While the secrets of Flight 980 might still remain scattered along the side of Mount Illimani, until then, this entire situation will remain a mystery. This is Barely Sociable. Have a good night.
That was really good. That was really good. Yeah, I think Barely Sociable did the documentary on the Silk Road that I watched. Yeah, that was really good. Um, yeah, I don't think it was just a navigational error. There's definitely something else going on there. It's definitely a cover up. 100%. Time is it? 10:30? Probably gonna do some games here in a little bit. I'm gonna turn on one more video while I run to use the restroom. Go get something to drink. I'll listen to it while I'm doing that. I love the stuff that they do. Thing on Japan.
This video was made possible by Total War
I'll be
3
back.
Champions, the brand new strategy game from the multi-award winning Total War series. Support my channel by using the link in the description down below to buy the game on Steam. Also, new merch available now in the store, including a mystery new character pin. I wonder who it could be. Ancient China. The sun is shining, the birds are singing, the children are playing in the village square. What a wonderful time to be alive! Hey, the Yellow River flooded again and destroyed all your crops. And also we're being raided by nomadic tribesmen. And also this period of Chinese history may be entirely mythical, meaning you may not even exist. Well, that would certainly explain the laser eyes. Chinese civilization began around the year 2000 BC when the possibly mythical Xia dynasty was formed. Throughout China's history, dynasties would usually rise up with a powerful leader who worked for the good of the people. But over time, the leaders would become more corrupt and self-serving. Someone would inevitably build a lake of alcohol, and the angry populace would overthrow them, giving way for a new dynasty to rise. Following this pattern, the Xia dynasty was replaced by the Shang, who liked bronze and writing, but then the leaders got corrupt, and were replaced by the Zhou, who liked iron and philosophy. But that one sort of just fell apart, and was replaced by the Qin, who liked building walls and people made out of rock. But they were pretty tyrannical from the start, and were quickly replaced by the Han, who liked creating new trade routes and getting in touch with their emotions. In line with this pattern, the Han dynasty came about under the strong and popular leadership of Emperor Gaozu. The dynasty remained firmly in place for over 4 centuries and was considered a golden age in Chinese history, developing new forms of art, political thinking, technology. Oh, looks like all the leaders got corrupt. See, probably the biggest problem in ancient China's political system that allowed so much corruption to come about all the time was a little something called court culture. Let me explain. Imagine for me, if you will, that you are the son of the Chinese emperor. Hooray! Now, apart from how weird it is that you have a ton of stepmoms and many of them would like to kill you, and also all of your friends are middle-aged dudes with no dongs, life's pretty alright. One day, your father says, "Son, I know our relationship hasn't been the best, and I've never said this before, but I just want to let you know that I love you." Oh no, I'm having a heart attack! Look at you. Now you're the emperor. I'm so proud of you. But wait, you are but a child and have no idea how to rule over a massive empire. Fret not, because just about everyone in your court wants to help you out with that. Hey man, remember me? I'm your mom's bro. Anyway, I heard you needed someone to rule over China for you. I mean, to help you rule China. So hey, here's a popsicle. I hope we can get along. No way, man. We've been your friends and your personal caretakers your whole life. And even though we may have no dongs, I think you should give us all the power to rule China. I mean, help you rule China. So who will you be influenced by? Your scheming uncle or your loyal eunuchs? And towards the end of the Han Dynasty, a string of child emperors allowed more and more power to fall into the hands of the eunuchs. Oh no!
I thought they had one on
scheming too.
Samurai.
They began handing out government jobs for bribes, heavily
I can
taxing the
check.
poor for their own wealth. And while you're sitting there eating your popsicle, everyone in your court is literally murdering each other to try and consolidate more power and riches for themselves. While all the peasants are outside like, hey, did you guys know there's been a drought out here for 2 years? Guys, obviously the people weren't too happy that while they were struggling to survive, they were also being heavily taxed so that the eunuch faction could all have rockin' mansions, complete with swimming pools and Alexas. So finally, when a self-proclaimed Taoist wizard came along and was like, you know whose fault it is that we're all out here starving? It's the emperor and his posse. They've lost their mandate from heaven, and the imperial family must be destroyed with an unrelenting, furious wrath. Also, check this out. Huh? Can you tell what it is yet? Ta-da! It's a little kitty cat. Look at her little ears. The people loved his political philosophy. He promised them land reforms, and his followers grew in number. They began arming themselves and wearing yellow turbans. And they also developed a really catchy slogan. In the year 184, the Yellow Turban Rebellion broke out across China, with millions rising up against the Han Dynasty. And the imperial government in the capital city freaked out. With all their internal bickering, they were completely unprepared and unable to deal with such a huge rebellion. So they were forced to call on independent warlords from across the empire to help them deal with this situation. Some big names took part in the fighting. I'm talking the likes of the great Cao Cao, the tyrannical Dong Zhou, Liu Bei, Sun Jian, and many other Chinese names I am definitely not pronouncing correctly. These warlords crushed the rebellion in their own respective regions, and with casualties in the millions, the Han Dynasty breathed a huge sigh of relief. But what they didn't realize is that by relying on all the warlords and their armies, they had essentially diminished their own central control over the empire. And
Not gonna lie, I'm bored with this. I don't care about ancient history as much. I mean, it's all the same story. It's feudalism, and then one civilization overthrows another, and it's all imperialism. Like it's the same concept over and over again. I like ancient history if it's interesting. Exactly. I think this is just like, oh, another large empire getting thrown. Like the Celts and stuff. Exactly. Like I like when you're talking about like ancient Greece and stuff is cool. That shit's fun. I want to see if Second Thoughts put out anything new. Ah, here's the video on the U.S. and meddling in foreign affairs.
This episode and others like
This
it
is
are
fun.
made possible by the generous
I've
support
seen
of my
this,
patrons on
but
Patreon.
it's still really
if
good.
you'd like to help support my channel and get early access to every video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought.
Let's get this straight. How would it be if the United States were viewed by the rest of the world as interfering with the elections directly of other countries, and everybody knew it? What would it be like if we engaged in activities that he is engaged in? It diminishes the standing of a country that is desperately trying to make sure it maintains its standing as a major world power.
That's part of what makes us special.
We don't overthrow democracies, Jack. That's malarkey. We don't affect other people's elections.
As Americans, unlike the old empires, we don't make these sacrifices for territory or for resources. We do it because it's right.
Every time I see that clip, I can't help but laugh at it. We do it because it's right.
It's funny. The countries which have spent the greatest amount of time enslaving, invading, overthrowing, and exploiting the rest of the world are for some reason seen as the torchbearers of civilization today. While many powerful and wealthy nations engage in this sort of behavior, none hold a candle to the United States. In this episode, we're going to debunk the myth that the US does not interfere in foreign affairs, and take a brief look at the mountains of evidence that show, contrary to what US leaders would have you believe, this country is the most meddlesome in the world. To give some context for Biden's speech at the beginning of the video, he was talking about Russia's alleged attempts to meddle in US elections. While much of the Russia fear-mongering was, and is, an attempt to deflect blame for America's own problems, we need to realize that most strong nations are always messing with their peers and competitors to their own advantage. Espionage or throwing a wrench in foreign affairs is not some fringe approach to global geopolitical jockeying. It has, for a very long time, been a fairly common method of one nation trying to get ahead of others. Russia does it, the US does it, France, the UK, you name it. It's immature and ahistorical to throw a fit about other nations meddling when your own nation is doing the same thing. It's especially ridiculous if you're the President of the United States, the nation guilty of the most foreign interventions by far. We'll start with US interference in elections specifically.
Well, as Special Counsel Robert Mueller continues his probe into Russian meddling into the 2016 election, we take a look back at Washington's record of meddling in elections across the globe. By one count, the United States has interfered in more than 80 foreign elections between 1946
more than 80.
And that doesn't count U.S.-backed coups and invasions.
Since the end of World War II,
God damn, that doesn't count us. Oh my
The
God.
outcome of elections in Italy, Iran, Japan, Brazil, Costa Rica, Chile, Uruguay, Italy again, El Salvador, Panama, Nicaragua, Ukraine, Russia, Mongolia, El Salvador again, and Palestine, to name just a few. Each of these instances failed to make the kind of news that Russian meddling is making today. I guess it's different when you're on the receiving end. And you don't have to take my word for it. Here's former CIA Director James Woolsey openly admitting our efforts to undermine the democratic process in order to further U.S. interests.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system in order to avoid the communists from taking over. For example, in Europe, in 47, 48, 49, the Greeks and the Italians, we
don't do that now, though? We don't mess around other people's elections, Jim?
Only for a very good cause.
Can you do that? Do a Vine video on a former CIA director.
Only for a very good cause in the interests of democracy.
All right, thanks for being here.
You'll notice that he can't even say we're no longer meddling in foreign elections. This should be obvious to anyone keeping up with current events, but it's pretty damning to hear.
Of course he's cringe. He's the head of the fucking CIA, or was the former head of the CIA.
For very good reasons and in the interest of democracy. Now, it was my understanding that the democratic process meant the people of their respective nations had the right to make their voices heard at the ballot box, free from coercion or interference. If that's the case, then the United States government's definition must be something entirely different. In what world is it in the interest of democracy to have a foreign intelligence agency undermining elections to influence the result? That's like burning a house down and saying you're doing it to prevent fires. Okay, so wait. If the United States isn't actually defending democracy around the world, if we're actively undermining the democratic process, why are we doing it? What's the real reason? Well, if you take a look at the history of US activity abroad, it shouldn't be hard to find the answer. Nearly every single foreign intervention by the United States, with very few exceptions, has been in the interest of acquiring resources, expanding our imperial reach and establishing new military footholds, or overthrowing governments that refuse to bend the knee to US superiority, and installing puppet regimes more agreeable to US goals in the region. This may sound uncharitable, but it's objectively true. We have libraries worth of evidence of the imperialist crimes of the United States. I've left some examples in the description. It's not random either. The capitalist powers, especially the US, have very specific targets they try to sabotage. What kind of governments does the US try to undermine? It is always those that have implemented or are beginning to implement left-wing economic policies. The United States corporate-controlled government understands that humane, common-sense, worker-centric policies are incredibly appealing to the average person, including Americans. U.S. leadership does not want to run the risk of a successful left-wing economy growing large enough to offer the world an alternative to destructive, genocidal capitalism. But trying to influence the outcome of elections will only get you so far. If you really want to throw a wrench in things, you need to take a more aggressive approach. This is where the US really shines. You've probably seen this infographic floating around online. It's a little outdated at this point, and doesn't even include all the US's interventions, but the fact that the United States, the supposed defender of freedom and democracy, has engaged in at least 56 military interventions in Latin America since 1890 is insane. When casting doubt on an election outcome...
That one right there. El Salvador, U.S. funds and directs death squads, crushing Popular People's Movement, killing 75,000 and destroying movement.
Freedom and democracy.
CIA funds and directs Contra death squads against Popular People's Movement, murdering 50,000 and destroying movement.
Has engaged in at least 56 military interventions in Latin America since 1890 is insane. When casting doubt on an election outcome just isn't enough, the imperial powers have some other tricks up their sleeve. The favorites of the United States are fomenting coups, funding right-wing death squads, and sending in the CIA or paramilitary groups to cause as much chaos and disarray as possible. The list is far too long to cover in depth, but let's take a look at just a couple of the more well-known examples. We'll start with Chile.
Tuesday, September the 11th. Out of an early autumn sky, 2 jets launch a deadly
The 1970s 9/11
attack on a potent symbol of democracy and freedom in a nation's capital. The result is fire, suicide, and ultimately the death or disappearance of over 3,000 people. Shockwaves are felt around the world. This is the story of one day in September.
Since the early 1930s, Chile had been a shining example of democracy and political stability in Latin America. All of that came to a screeching halt in September of 1973. Salvador Allende, a physician and socialist politician, had been elected president in September of 1970, making him the first Marxist to hold the office of president in a Latin American liberal democracy. The United States didn't like that. Allende had served his country in various government positions for over 40 years before ascending to the presidency. And as president, his platform included nationalizing key industries, improving and expanding education, and improving the living conditions of the working class. These common-sense policies made him quite popular among the Chilean people, though decidedly less popular with the right-wing parties that controlled other parts of the government, and even less popular with the United States, which had begun actively plotting to overthrow the democratically elected Chilean president and install a puppet dictator. These plans came to fruition on September 11, 1973. The Chilean military, supported and advised by the CIA, laid siege to the presidential palace. Allende vowed he would not leave, and instead broadcast what would become his final speech to his fellow Chileans, an inspiring call to never give up and look towards a brighter future free from oppression.
From inside the palace, Allende refused to leave, true to his promise not to surrender the government for which the ordinary people of Chile had voted. He broadcast this last message, then he shot himself.
Trabajadores de mi patria, tengo fe en Chile y su destino. Llegan ustedes sabiendo que mucho más temprano que tarde, de nuevo, abrirán las grandes alamedas por donde pase el hombre libre para construir una sociedad mejor. ¡Viva Chile! ¡Viva el pueblo! ¡Vivan los trabajadores!
Allende took his own life rather than let the US-backed coup plotters capture him. After the military seized power, General Augusto Pinochet established a military dictatorship, which would remain in place until 1990, crippling the Chilean economy and destroying all the progress made by Allende's socialist initiatives. You've probably seen right-wingers make references to pushing their political opponents out of helicopters. They're referring to Chile under Pinochet. It was common during that bloody period for the military to kidnap dissidents, take them up in helicopters, and throw them out, typically over the water, and usually with their stomachs cut open, so that their bodies would sink. At Pinochet's direction, thousands of Chileans were tortured, executed, or disappeared. All of this was the result of the United States and their genocidal commitment to ensuring no economic system could ever offer an alternative to capitalism. Let's look at another example, Nicaragua. After the revolution, during which the socialist Sandinistas overthrew the Somoza dictatorship in 1979, The United States once again set its sights on Latin America. The US had originally intended to work out some kind of agreement with Nicaragua, but when the country chose to side with the global socialist movement and work with Cuba and the Soviet Union instead, the US quickly changed its approach. As with Chile, US leadership was completely unwilling to allow a budding left-wing economy to grow to eventually challenge the myth of capitalist superiority. They feared a socialist movement, a genuinely democratic movement, unlike the facade of democracy we have in the US, would inspire revolutions throughout Latin America. In December of 1981, Reagan authorized covert operations in Nicaragua. These operations would eventually include funding, arming, and training what were called the Contras, groups dedicated to overthrowing the new government. Among the equipment provided by the CIA were instruments of torture and assassination, one of the more egregious actions that earned the United States a slap on the wrist for violation of international law was the CIA's production and distribution of a manual titled Psychological Operations in Guerrilla Warfare. This guidebook, which the CIA distributed to their loyal right-wing death squads, encouraged the assassination of certain targets, including non-military personnel like judges, police officers, and government officials. It also encouraged the inciting of riots and shootings which would result in the death of selected members of the Contras themselves, with the aim of turning them into martyrs and thereby building support for the Contra cause. The United States would continue to sow chaos in Nicaragua for years, amassing a death toll of over 50,000 people and destroying the popular democratic movement. These are just two examples from one region. In Latin America alone, the United States has launched at least 56 military interventions in recent memory. And don't make the mistake of assuming that's all in the past. It still happens. The Venezuelan police captured a group of American coup plotters just last year. And as we speak, we're witnessing a surge of right-wing opposition to the democratic election of socialist candidate Pedro Castillo in Peru. It is absolutely guaranteed those factions are working with U.S. intelligence agencies to undermine the democratic process and prevent socialism from gaining any ground. Latin America represents the front lines in the fight to throw off the yoke of capitalism and build a brighter, freer future, without the oppression of the United States or the other imperialist powers. It is essential that Western socialists support these struggles for self-determination. But Latin America isn't the only target. We've also seen decades of coups and attempted nation-building by the US in the Middle East and in Asia. There's a reason the United States is running 24/7 propaganda operations and has over 400 military bases surrounding China, a country that routinely supports growing socialist movements in other countries. So, when US officials claim that we don't meddle in foreign elections, that we do what we do for the sake of defending democracy and freedom, understand that they're lying to you, and they know it. The United States does not defend democracy abroad. We don't even have real democracy at home. American leadership has lied about socialism for over a century. And if you don't believe me, read the CIA's own words on Stalin, saying that the Western conception of communism is wrong, and that the Soviet Union did indeed have collective leadership, as opposed to the strongman dictator myth that American leadership peddles to this day. All of this information is out in the open. You can find it just by searching a few keywords online. The fact that the President of the United States can address the American people and brazenly claim that this country does not meddle in foreign affairs should be insulting to you. Every US administration is counting on the fact that the American citizens will never take the time to educate themselves and deconstruct the imperialist propaganda. Prove them wrong. Read non-Western sources. Talk to people from different countries. Learn actual history. The internet makes all of this easier than it's ever been. Moving the needle away from genocidal imperialism and capitalist domination and towards egalitarian socialism and true democracy will be a challenge. It will require average people going out of their way to correct.
Okay, dude. Here's the thing. With that, the problem is not necessarily what's the word? It's not necessarily the apprehension for a predominantly capitalist country to have against places like the originally the Soviet Union, as well as China. And I'm not like I'm not gonna sit here and defend either of those countries on some of the more imperialist shit that they've done too, as well as all the fucked up shit that Stalin did during the Soviet Union being a thing. But there have been a lot of small socialist, worker-oriented policy, like countries that have had policies like that have been just completely shut down by America due to that's going to turn into communism. When the reality of it is that it's not in the best interest for America to see that a moderate socialist government is not necessarily um, all that bad, or how effective a moderate socialist government could actually be. Uh, so, trying to think. Wonder if I should just play games now. I don't know how I would play.
Hey.
There's so many freaking YouTube videos that start with that one song. Hmm. Yeah, I think we're gonna switch to games. I don't know what we're gonna play yet though. I'm debating on playing some MTG, or I could play some Warzone or some Fall Guys. Haven't really decided. Could play Kingdom Hearts. What time is it? Puppy's got to go out pretty soon. I guess I'll go ahead and do my dailies on Arena. Is that how I spell it? I have no idea how to spell dailies. There we go. Cast 20 creatures, cast 20 blue or black spells. Oh, that's easy. Wait, was I doing a traditional standard event? Oh, that's perfect. We'll just play Dimir Rogues for a minute. Let's turn on some music. All right. We got a counter spell, creature. And into the story. This hand's technically keepable. This guy's Flash. Yeah. What's he gonna... Oh, he's gonna play it? Yeah, I think I got this guy. Yo, this is really good. Nice. Not what I needed to see. Yeah. Hmm.
Never thought it'd fall so hard, but it happened. You're so far away, I feel a magnet. Light up in person. More than a dream, oh, this has to happen.
Greedy ass hand, but I'm gonna keep it and hope it works out. I lucked out so hard. So bad. Alright, that's gonna be it for me.
You shot my conscience, flew up to the